All right. Actually, this all started when Leslie Freidstern happened to mention one time how many bar mitzvahs there were in the year 2006. And I thought back to myself and I said, God, when my family moved here in 1937, there was really nobody. And so I started to reflect on it, and I asked Leslie, how many there were bar mitzvahs there were in 1940? And he says, no. And I said, one, it was me. And I said there hadn't been one for maybe Billy August the year before me, and I don't think there was anybody else for 2 years after me. So he said, how interesting. And I thought that was the end of the conversation when he happened to bring it up again in the show, mentioning this time when he said how many bar mitzvahs there were in 206, how many there were in 1937, because there were no Jews in Northampton. So then I started to reflect when he asked me to speak. So I thought of what it was now. In a way, there were no, in Northampton at that time, there were no shopping centers for anything. Every single thing was on Main Street. And Main Street was the center of the universe as far as all of Northampton, and not only that, but Chesterfield, Williamsburg, Goshen, you name it. Buses used to come in, like with Grand Central Station, and stop on Main Street, and people would do their shopping, particularly on Saturday night. Saturday night, I remember, because we had a store on Main Street, and my parents would both be away, and they'd say, well, you know, we won't be home tonight until 9 o'clock because the stores are open late. And so I knew that, and so we knew that was a big day, big deal with everybody coming in. And you get your groceries and your clothing and your beer, everything. There wasn't a thing on. In fact, the shopping center now is largely moved to King Street and so forth. And there were no shopping centers. That was freight yards and junk yards. And as a matter of fact, my cousin was involved in that when they sold the Boston and Maine Railroad. McKinnis sold it. And my cousin was a real estate man who bought most of that real estate, which was our real estate siding. He came in the store and he says, Norm, you want a store on King Street? And I says, no, Main Street's the center. And he said to me, someday King Street's going to be the Main Street, and Main Street's going to be the King Street. And so I turned to my father and mother, and we all laughed, and that was the end of it.
What was your cousin's name?
Paul Mannis.
Paul Mannis.
Yeah.
Okay.
The grocery stores, drugstores, as they say, clothing stores, lady stores, bakeries. And in those days, grocery stores were grocery stores. They had groceries. Bakeries had bakeries. Fish stores had fish stores. Chicken had chicken. Butcher shops had butcher. And they weren't combined. So there were very few automobiles, and as I said, all buses. Saturday night was a shopping night. Now, as far as I look back when Leslie asked me to give this talk, how many Jewish doctors and lawyers and dentists and so forth were there in Northampton? There were zero. In fact, there was only one physician who came into town and found his way here, and he couldn't really make a living. This was the height of the Depression. Barney Carlson, who had been here for some time in the Jewish community, and whose father had started Carlson and Barger Junkyard, which was quite large up on Upper King Street.
Could you say the name again slowly?
Carlson, Barney Carlson.
And the name of the junkyard?
Was Carlson and Barger.
Okay, on King Street.
On King Street. And it wasn't just a junkyard. They bought scrap metal by old freight cars and freight stations and so forth. And he more or less bought the thing and sold it. And he and his brother, Ben, were in that business, carried over from their father.
What years are we talking about?
We're talking about the year back about 1937. And I might just interject at this point that actually I did look back in the directory, and there were, I think, 4 or 5 Jewish junk dealers at the time. That was the thing to do. And one of them in particular, I remember, had a horse and a wagon. And he would typically go around yelling, rags, metal, whatever. And that was Barver. His name was Barver, B-A-U-V-E-R. He also moonlighted or daylighted as the Shamus in the show, which was down on Bridge Street. It was, I think, 13 or 15 Bridge Street. So as I was getting back to very few, no lawyers, this one doctor, Edward Brick. Edward Brick really wasn't making a living, but as I said, the connection was Barney Carlson, who was a kind of a wheel in Northampton at the time, got him to be the city physician. There was no Social Security, there was really nothing, and there were people, indigent people, or just people out of luck, who needed medical attention. So Dr. Brick was appointed the city doctor, and he really struggled until after the war. After the war, when people had money, they remembered Dr. Brick was the one who took care of them, and so he really had quite a flourishing practice post-World War II. So as I said, no Social Security, unemployment was high. My father, I remember one time, he mentioned, tax returns, and taxes were almost non-existent, and he had a small business. And you either file a tax, you go to a lawyer, and for $5, he'd write, this guy made no money, and that was the $5 fee, and that was the end of it.
Tell me about your father and mother. Tell me their names, your mother's maiden name, where they came from, and when they came to Northampton.
Okay, my mother's maiden name was Bennett. She was Elizabeth Bennett. She was the youngest of 10 children in the Bennett family that all settled in Cambridge around 1880. They didn't come as one group. The first ones that came were 4 boys who were headed for the Russian army for a period of 7 years. And my grandmother was not going to have any part of that. So they'd been sewing money for years and hiding it in their garments, so that when they go out, they said everybody in Russia and Poland were as crooked as could be. And there was almost like they could have a sign over the door, so-and-so for so many Jews going over. So they knew, and they handed them the money, and they waved you on. So the 4 boys got to Liverpool, and they talked about the dismal treatment they got going across Europe as just Jews going away. And they were particularly contemptuous of the greeting that was given to them by the German Jews, who looked at them as uncouth bumpkins, compared to the German Jews, who were very well integrated. Anyway, they made it to Liverpool, and they came across, I guess, in steerage. The shipping companies, of course, were interested in selling wheat and whatever to Europe, and it was a shame to take back an empty ship. So they filled it full of these people who paid so much. They had the allocated money, and they ended up in Boston. And there was no immigration, there was no nothing. They just got off, and I don't know how they ever made it, but they established a residence in Cambridge and made their way to Concord. Now, in Concord, at the time, the Jews in Russia, while they were on shtetls, I mean, they're more or less, you could say ghettos because of the way in Western Europe, but they had these little villages where Jews really weren't allowed to own land or anything. So the Jews, more or less, as I understood it from what the family says, they were all trained. Either they were apprenticed out to a tailor or a carpenter or a plumber or a shoemaker or whatever. And so they would go through a long training period. And I think these boys, some of them went through 5 and 7 years of training as tailors. So, and my grandfather too had been trained as that. And so the boys came over and started up a custom, not one of these hacky things like my father's side, where they turned out vests or collars or whatever they told them to do, but custom tailoring, in which they had receipts that my mother had some time ago of what they were charging for suits in Concord to these wealthy Yankees. There was no Hart, Schaffner, and Marks, no custom tailoring. And some of these Yankees in Concord and so forth had the money, and they were willing to pay quite a bit. I was surprised to see some of these suits at the time looked like they were $100, $150 for custom suits. So the long shot of it was that they managed to, Jews were welcome to set this up as a business in Concord, but they weren't really welcome to live there. So the closest place they could find was Cambridge. And so they settled in Cambridge and became, there were finally 3 shulls in Cambridge. And my family, to some extent, was instrumental in all of them. And my grandfather had the name James Ulysses Bennett. I guess his name was Ucasil, and Ulysses was pretty close. I never heard that name before, but it was translated to Ulysses, and James went with it, and Bennett was good too. And so they had this family thing, and the way they set up a kind of a, they had a corporation. I talked about this recently. A corporation in Cambridge where the sisters who had been in this group finally came over, and they had an organization which was duly licensed in Cambridge in the early 20s. And they would put money into it. And then as each member decided it was time to bring another member in from Europe, they would all pull their money together, and they would bring over somebody, and then he would bring over somebody, and eventually they got them all out of this little shtetl.
What was this organization called? Do you know?
I don't know the name, but it was the only woman's legal entity that had the license to do this. I don't know what its name was.
What were the names of the shuls that you think your family was?
I don't remember that too, but one of them is still in existence. And somebody that I met recently that I think has said she saw my grandfather's name up on one of the founders.
Uh-huh.
Now, 2 of them were kind of flimsy, and I remember even when I was a kid, one of them had deteriorated to the point where I think they turned it over to a black organization. Mm-hmm. And the other one was at that time, a large brick edifice. I used to go to Sunday school, and there's where all my cousins would be.
Uh-huh.
So anyway, in the long run, what they did is, I hate to get into my family because you're not in.
What was the name of the tailor business, this custom tailor?
I don't know.
Okay.
It was like...
So your mother settled in Cambridge.
Right. But the whole family, I mean,
the whole family.
She was the youngest of 10.
How did she then end up coming out this way?
Well, there's a long jump to that because she was an infant. So, I mean, we're talking back in 1900 sometime, 1902 or 3. And then till she met my father and got married wasn't until 1927. And my father's family wasn't so glorious, but they decided they had enough in Russia too. And they made it over, but they came through the port of New York, I think. And anyway, they got sick of New York, and my father and the family moved up to Boston. That grandfather, I think, was in the tailoring end of it too, but he was in one of these where they turn out, mass produce in a factory, as opposed to my mother's side. And they met up, actually my mother's next younger sister happened to see my father and kind of must have asked him, are you married or whatever? And he said no, and she said, well, you got to come over to my house. And so she set it up, and that's what happened.
So your father was living in Cambridge, Boston area?
Boston area someplace.
Okay. So then what brought them out to Northampton in 1930 something?
Well, in 1937, my father had established it. This is one of the things I was going to say on Main Street because it's typical. Well, what happened is the original generation that came over could only do what they were trained to do. If they were trained to be tailors, they were trained to be tailors, carpenters, plumbers, and so forth. Many times in my family alone, there were illustrations of where they would start with appeared to be a junk business, and they turn it into a major production, or an ordinary tailoring thing, and they turn it into a custom tailoring. Or one was just a shoemaker. And by the time the next generation came along, they leased a machine from United Shoe and somehow got into the shoe manufacturing. And so these things happen. So what I said in my thing is, typical to Main Street, the first generation would come through, be skilled in trades or whatever, but with a strong determination that their children wouldn't do the same thing. So it's illustrated on Main Street here too. But my father decided he's not going to be a tailor, but he could be a salesman. And so he somehow scraped the money together, and he had an Army-Navy store, and it was really going in the Boston-Somerville area. And it was really going fine, and things were great. And then they were married in 27, and the Depression came along. And he went to work one day, and he found that all the factories, he had like an Army-Navy store, where he wasn't selling high-class merchandise. He was selling more or less workmen's clothing, caps, underwear, women's house dresses, things like that. And he finds that the gates on the factories are closed. And people would say, we love doing business with you, but we need food, we don't need clothes, so we'll make do. So, socks can be sewed and clothes can be handed down and so forth. So the long shot of that was that they couldn't sustain that business, and he went out. And so he had to drift around for a while looking for work. And my cousin, one of my cousins, was influential in the state government. You almost had to have a pull to get so many weeks' work on the WPA. And so this Manus family would get him, so many works doing this. But there was only so many times because they had to shuffle this around. And so finally one of them that I mentioned managed to have a shoe factory going. He worked in a shoe factory for a while, but he had to live in Brockton and pay an ad there and for a board and room and send the rest of the money back to us in Cambridge. And finally the family got together in this corporation that they had set up and said, look, you've got to go back in business. And they each pulled in so much money and said, they looked around and he decided to go to Northampton. There was they were starting at that time these pine board kind of it was like a patent medicine store. It wasn't really a drugstore because there was no pharmacy in it. There was no prescription center. But you could sell the rest of the things, particularly if you specialized in cosmetics and things like that. So more or less they were on a list for this company called Carroll Cosmetics. And so my father was on that list, and they called and said, we were passing through this little town out in the western part of the state. We saw this vacant store, and maybe you could, so they took it, he came out here, and it was 1935 or 6, and looked at it, and finally they agreed, the family pulled money together, and they opened up this little store, and my mother and father struggled with it.
And what was the name of the store?
It was Carroll Cosmetics.
Okay. How big a store was it?
Oh, I don't think it was more than 300 or 400 square feet. Very small, very, very small. It was in the Draper Hotel building. The Draper Hotel is currently on Main Street. Was an old hotel. It was like an old stagecoach hotel right in the center of Main Street, where it was later knocked down and a Newberry was put in, and that was later put down and a bank was put in. And that's where the bank is. What's the name of the bank? Bank North is there now. So anyway, you had one little store, and I think the rent was $75 a month. And they started, my mother and father worked there, and I worked and I was in the 4th grade.
When they moved?
When they moved.
What kind of customers did they have? Were they local middle-class people?
Local middle-class people.
Uh-huh.
And the idea was it was cut rate. And so that a thing that might be, it was during the Depression, and so the bottles would say Bayer Aspen 50 cents a bottle, they would have it 37 cents. You know, things like that. Where there was no ornate fixture display. And what it was, in fact, I have some of the fixtures downstairs. I couldn't let them go. I used it for bookcases. I just couldn't let it, because I remember where they had so much money to put up the bookshelves, the shelves, and they were on adjustable clips. Instead of like a real high-class pharmacy had mahogany and oak and stained and all the windows and everything. The whole thing was just, look, it's painted wood, cheap. Everything is inexpensive, and things are all on the counter, all on the shelf. Look at the price, and just, you know, it was really. And he never trimmed the window in his life, but he learned how to. They put it all in the window, you know. Bayer Aspen 37 cents, Alka-Seltzer 23 cents, Lost Leaders Kleenex 19 cents, all these things. And over a period of time, people would come in and they tell their neighbors, and gradually, he saved his original books, and it was even now, I almost think of crying when I say $18 a day or whatever. So,
how many years did he do this business?
well,
From
I
$1935.
took it over. That's one of the things I was leading into in
Please.
here.
Yeah.
Where they had this type of thing, and that was more or less typical. They had started it, anchored it, built it up, and then my mother kept saying, well, if we only had a prescription desk, a pharmacy in here, we could make it so much bigger and better and improve it. And look, where we have perfume now, we could move that to the side and put in a big prescription desk. Anyway, I was kind of interested I majored in chemistry and pharmacy. So eventually I went into it, but that was what the only thing is that was going to kind of lead into it, because this is what more or less happened up and down the street. I have a list of, so anyway, to go back just momentarily to lead into that, the show was on the odd side of Bridge Street down near Holly Street. It was an old Episcopal church. They bought it from St. John's. St. John's, I guess, had more or less had mercy on them, figuring let's give them a start. And I think, I may be wrong, but I think the whole thing cost them $14,000 or something like that, which they had. It was a low figure, and I'm sure the Episcopal Church made nothing on it. But it was this old raggedy building that I went to Hebrew school in. It was down where there's a shopping center there now. It's where L&H Appliance is. But it used to be the shul, and there was a big White House next to it.
Do you want to speak a little more about the shul now?
Yeah, I could do that. The show was, you won't believe what it was like. It was probably, I don't know how long St. John's had it, but they finally moved out because it was, they could really afford more, and they couldn't stay there anymore. It had a fairly good location. If you were Jewish, you could walk to it, because most of the Jews in that time lived near the central area of Main Street, because most of them, in fact, I talk about it later, most of the Jews who lived in Northampton actually earned their living on Main Street in various things that I'll mention later. And so it was kind of a fringy-looking thing to begin with, but they did as much as they could to fix it up. It had a first floor that had where the services were held, with the things adapted for Jewish ceremonies. And in the back there was a kind of a meeting hall. One room. I mean, these weren't divided into rooms. And so if you had several meetings going on at the same time, you were in this corner and the one was in that corner and the other corner, and you talked quietly. And it was a fairly large room, but nothing was divided, so you really, if we had Sunday school and something else was going on, somebody was doing the other thing. The Hebrew school was in one corner, and the Hebrew school was all one big class, whether you were 9, 10, 11, 12, or 13.
Were the women separated from
Yes,
the men? Can you
yes,
describe what it
yes.
was, where the women sat?
Yes, downstairs in the first place was kind of a done-over kitchen with a large meeting place where they could serve meals. And some of the women were really good cooks, including Eva August, who was a professional cook. They owned Jack August. And so they were really good, so you could look forward to a good meal, because they would do it. Nobody had a catered meal. First of all, it had to be kosher. No one could afford, I don't even think they had catering services. If they did, it would have to come from Hartford, not Springfield. And so they would do it right there, and so everything was kosher. The women originally were scheduled to sit up in a balcony upstairs. Of course, as I mentioned, the balcony was so old. The show itself was so old. The building was so old. It was on the verge of being condemned when they got it. Shortly after they have it, or a while afterwards, it was the second floor was condemned. And so much to the chagrin of many of these older members, because it was strictly Orthodox. When we got here, the older men who would be around the show would were speaking Yiddish. And it was strictly Orthodox and insistent that the women be upstairs in the show and for the services. And when the city finally condemned it and said, look, you can't put people there, so they finally had to sit in the back, all segregated, women were there. And it was such that the place was more or less stratified that some of the families who were old-time residents, I mean, we came in 37, so we were already, newcomers in 37. Some people had been here longer, like the August family, and they have like their reserved place. And nobody dares sit in these first 4 seats.
How did you know they were reserved? Were their names there?
No.
You just knew?
You just knew that wasn't for you. Because if you go there, you would get a look, or you'd go over and sit in the back or something.
So the first families, so to speak, had
Right.
this section,
Yes.
second, third, fourth. It could have been by wealth or by who got there first.
No, I think it was more or less tradition. Tradition.
Uh-huh.
They August family always had this thing, and you didn't dare do it.
Can you name some of the other people?
Well, they'll be on this.
Please, go ahead. Yeah.
So I went down here. Rabbi Fishman was the rabbi who was here when I was here. Rabbi Fishman was kind of a brave soul in that I explained to him when I first started for Hebrew school, I said, I can't sing at all. I can't carry a note. I don't understand music. And he says, don't worry. Billy August was bar mitzvahed a couple of years ago. If he can do it, you can do it. And then he changed his mind, because I would look back while I was davening, and I'd see him looking soulfully up to heaven for why me? And shortly after I was bar mitzvah, and he went off to they were setting up these services for Jewish refugees that they managed to get out somehow. And so Rabbi Fishman left, and a rabbi came in who was, I think his name was Rabbi Lowenstein, who had been a refugee from Germany, and his family had been rabbis for generation after generation. This man had degrees of all kinds, and he was willing to come to Northampton mostly because Smith College was, he could be a lecturer at Smith College in religion. And so he was here, and the show was good for the show because they figured they've got a rabbi. When push came to shove, the men I mentioned, there were about a dozen men who were the old-timers, the original ones who could only speak Yiddish, the ones who were the junk dealers and the meat market men, the butchers and so forth. They wanted somebody who could really kill chickens. This rabbi wasn't going to do this.
Sure.
He was a lecturer. And push came to shove, he went off to Leominster, I think, where they really had a congregation that could offer him money, and he didn't have to kill chickens.
What years are we talking about?
We're talking about during the war. We're talking 1943 or 4, somewhere around there. Well, it had to be a little bit right after I was bar mitzvah. I was bar mitzvah in 1940.
Can you recall your bar mitzvah?
Yeah, I can. The thing is, it always astonishes even Charlotte when I tell her the way the thing really worked. Money was tight in those days, as I said. Money was pooled so my father could start the business. My mother, I was an only child, so my mother was insistent that I have a bar mitzvah. So it was to show off to her family, you know, most of whom didn't even know where Northampton was, since they only knew up as far as Framingham. Cambridge was it. So anyway, she was planning this thing, so how could I disappoint her? So anyway, I went through all this thing with the bar mitzvah and doing all this, going to the show and going down Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, skipping Friday, Saturday morning. Saturday morning they dragged me out if I was playing with the kids or whatever, and I'd come, so I usually go skating into the show. Only to be greeted by, here comes the bill to hire, because they'd be looking for me. They needed me. They couldn't make up a million. I was a key person, and I'd come skating in, and I could see they'd grab their head and really have all kinds of... they'd say things in Yiddish. They didn't realize that somehow I knew what they were saying, although I didn't speak Yiddish. I understood what they were saying. It wasn't complimentary.
Did your parents speak Yiddish?
Only when they didn't want me to know what was going on.
They did know Yiddish.
They could. Mostly because, as I said, my mother was the youngest of 10. And there was a descending group from my grandfather, who they would all speak Yiddish to, descending down through Aunt Rebecca, to each one of them. And as they got down to her age, they spoke less and less Yiddish and more English. So they got away from this whole thing. And so if they started talking Yiddish while I was around, I'd pay attention, because it either meant things were bad or I shouldn't know.
Did your father use Yiddish in his business at all?
No.
With his fellow Jews? No.
There was nobody around to... In fact, the only few times Yiddish might have helped us in speaking is to one salesman whose name was Hogan. His name was Hogan, he was Irish. And it turns out that he could speak Yiddish. He happened to be a salesman for a company that we really needed in cosmetics. With Shalimar, was Girl Lane. And in those days you went by the cosmetic line she had. And he would come in and talk to my father. And eventually, it was through my father that we got that whole Girl Lane line, because we were totally always opposed in getting cosmetic lines, because Forbes and Wallace owned McCallum's. And we were blocked from getting Revlon, which I eventually got, Girl Lane. The major lines we'd usually find there was a roadblock. So the one time Yiddish helped is Hogan pulled it through for us on getting that major line. But otherwise it didn't, because when we got here, many of the Jews had their cliques. They were all in one family or another. And it was just me, my father, and my mother, period. In my class, there was we had a young Judean club, of which I was the president, because I was a boy. And that was the only boy.
Who was in the club?
Well, the ones I remember were the 4 in my class in 1945 at Northampton High School. And that was Evie Lipshires and Eleanor Ziff, Bernice Clodney.
Could you say it again slowly, loud?
Yeah. Evelyn Lipshires, Eleanor Ziff, Bernice Clodney, and there was me. And then there were some kids who were in the classes below us who would come in, whose names kind of elude me, but in all we never had really more than 10. And we'd always look longingly toward Holyoke, because they had all these kids there, and We just had this little club all by ourselves. Now, I didn't speak about this at the time I spoke to the show. Is that there was rampant. I mean, from my standpoint, there was kind of a hidden anti-Semitism, but I think I saw it because originally when we moved here, we lived on Butler Place, which was one street away from where the Polish church was. Polish church was on the corner of Holly Street and Phillips Place. Butler Place was the next one over, and if you go up Phillips Place, you can cut through to Butler Place and see where my yard was. Because I would be walking, if I was going to school or coming up from Main Street, there'd be these Polish kids out in the street, and they'd, Zedek, 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 oh, how's Jerusalem, and all this kind of stuff. Not that I ever got into fights, but they were always there. And to make it worse, the Polish kids who went there may have been born in this country, but for all practical purposes, they weren't, because they only spoke Polish at home. And so English was almost a second language. When they would get into school, even in the 3rd and 4th and 5th grade, English grammar meant nothing to them. So in scaling it, they would always get either failing or very low grades, and if you just spoke normal English, you came out pretty good, so I must have looked like a genius just for being able to speak English fairly normally.
Were you known when you were in elementary school and junior high school and high school? Did your fellow students know you were Jewish?
If they did, they didn't allude to it, except for these Polish kids who somehow knew. Somehow, the others didn't refer to it at all that I can ever remember.
So not only did they say these words to you when you passed the church, but they also did this when you were in school?
Sometimes in the schoolyard, or more particularly, I think it was initiated by the Polish church. I really believe that the Polish church at that time, I may be wrong, but I think the Polish priests or whoever was teaching these kids in class were people they brought in from Poland, who came across from Poland with the original Polish distrust or dislike of Jews from the old country. The people in Northampton who had been here for a number of years more or less mellowed, and if they did exist, it was kept low. Now it came to the surface in my lifetime several times. This house that we're sitting in.
What's the address of this house?
280 Crescent.
Okay, tell me about it.
All right, we're on the Langworthy estate.
Langworthy.
Langworthy, this whole tract that you're looking at encompasses right now about 16 houses. It's located right in the center of Northampton, exactly across the street from where the Smith College quadrangle was built in 1925, I think. At the time it was known that the college was looking for land to build this large quadrangle. That quadrangle contains, I think, 2, 4, 6, about 8 different dorms, all in one group. And it required an enormous piece of land. Well, this man Langworthy had managed to accumulate this, and I guess his asking price was kind of high. And the college decided, we can do without you, and we'll build it on our side of the street, which they did. By which time, I guess he was really kind of annoyed with the whole thing. And so all the time that I was going to school, Northampton High School, we lived on Belmont Avenue, and we would have to walk by this place, and there was a big sign like for sale, and it was never, the land was never plowed or grass cut. It just looked like a wild, just a jungle, and nobody could figure out what happened. Anyway, there came a day when Langworthy died, and the people who inherited his estate didn't want to carry this feud on. They wanted the money. So they sold it, but I guess somehow Langworthy had instituted either a written or an unwritten
Covenant.
which said no Jews allowed. And I didn't realize it, my parents didn't realize it. In this whole thing, this was the last house that was sold because it was a show house. It was the one that he was showed from. You know, it had the whole finished basement and knotty pine and the whole deal. And the asking price was high, and by the time everything was sold and was down to the last house, and it came up for sale, and we saw it, and it was within walking distance if it snowed to go to the store. So we bought it, and and the last thing that was held it up was I heard the realtor kind of talking to the real estate man. Now, essentially, I wasn't a party to this. My parents bought the real estate. I was out of college by this time, and I was working in a store, but actually they were buying their first house. Yes, this house right here. And I heard the real estate man and she was a lady, Helen Hudnut, and they were kind of whispering.
Helen
Hudnut. And they were kind of whispering, and so it caught my attention, and I said, well, what's that all about? And so then they kind of sheepishly said, well, there's a restriction, or, well, we can take care of this. Anyway, I later found out the restriction was they had this. They probably couldn't have held it up in court. I don't know what it was, but the way they worked it, as I heard Helen Hutnett said, well, I'm retiring anyway. She was an old lady. This is my last thing. She got quite a commission out of this deal. It's the last one. She said, I'll buy it. So apparently the way it worked is she bought it, she sold it to us, she got a commission, and they avoided the whole thing. So since then, I guess it's been broken because right now there's several of these plots that have Jewish residents on them. So I guess that whole thing kind of fell through.
Where did most of the Jews live in the 1920s or 30s? Was there an area in town?
No, it's funny you should ask, because when we were getting married, this one here says to me...
This beloved wife? Yes.
Yes, this one.
Yeah.
She says, well, I said, well, no, believe me, I'll find a place. And she said, well, what's the matter with here and what's the matter with there? And so to satisfy her, I took her to a few places. I said, there is no Jewish area in Northampton. They're just scattered around. Initially, some were on William Street because it was a poorest section of the city. Some of them were, it's just no one place. They settled wherever they could get a deal, and as they settled in the lower areas, by the time I knew, they had moved out and gone up. The idea was to get from the side of the railroad tracks, essentially it runs through town, to Boston, Maine. That was the not-so-good section. That's where Market Street is, and William Street, and Hancock Street, and that down there. But as they got into their businesses, they later expanded and came up more toward Elm Street and so forth, mostly keeping within shot of the Main Street, because most of them realized they had to get to Main Street somehow. And the less transportation problem you had, if it snowed or rained or whatever, the better off you were.
They deal with the businesses on Main Street.
Right, that's how I'm coming to that. That's
okay.
More or less.
Was there any other anti-Semitism you remember?
Well, I was going to say, at this point, there was one other thing that I kind of remember that stuck out in my mind, and after you called, I kind of made another list. There was one I can remember in particular, in the building, the very place where my father and I put a prescription desk in my father's store, and we kind of expanded, so we had moved up into a better area on Main Street. And we were in a building, and above us was an insurance agency. And he would come in the store, and he would be real pals, knowing him, and how's Dad, and how's everything, and buy his products and everything. And gee, he's a great guy, and "Oh, by the way, Norm, I sell insurance, and I'm right here wherever you want me." And so great, we did give him insurance. And then, as I made friends in the community, I'd find out that at one point some Jews weren't being admitted, that if they were being admitted, it wasn't with graciousness into the country club. And so I guess there was a little hesitation. And I found out, somebody said to me, "Well, if you want to know why, it's your friend upstairs." I guess they had the ability, he was on the board, and they could blackball, do whatever they wanted. So I guess that happened. And some of these, see, it wasn't outright. It isn't like you read about New York or Boston where they have gangs. There were no gangs. There was, nothing that was outward. It was just kind of under the carpet type of a deal. There was another one when I came back. When I graduated high school and came back from the Navy, so I went around to the fraternities, even over here at UMass, realizing, well, I know some of the kids who were in class with me at Northampton High School, why don't I go visit them? So I went around, I realized I didn't have a shot in hell of getting into a non-Jewish fraternity. They'd greet you and talk about things, and then there was no bid. And where the bids came from were the two Jewish fraternities, of which I joined one of them. So there was that type of a thing going on.
What year is this we're talking about when you were at UMass?
Was the years, I came back from the Navy in 46, so it's 46, 47, 48, 49.
Where did you see service in the Navy?
Actually, I got in just as the war was ending. So I ended up in Boston in ship's company. As they pointed out, you're the last guys in, you'll be the last guys out. So you're going to be in ship service. And when everybody else is out, you close the door and then you go. And then I saw it, and I was back in college again, and I was in ROTC when the Korean War broke out. So there was Colonel right in our hallway in pharmacy, and they say, if you're in reserve, you better get into ROTC because they'll call you. So you get 2 years deferment to go finish this school because you've already been in once. So I was in ROTC and got commissioned, and it just has to be called up. They said the Air Force doesn't need you, but don't worry, you got a 20-year commitment, we'll need you sometime. And so I still have the thing on here. Finally, in 1972, they said, you're out. So that was it.
You were going to tell me about Main Street.
So Main Street. So actually, in that class of 45, there were 4 Jewish students. Evelyn Lipshire was probably the smartest girl in the whole class. Eleanor Ziff was probably the prettiest. And then there was 2 others. And there was another one who was really Jewish, but had nothing really to do with us. And till now he meets with our organization. So a story on Main Street. So my story began on February 22nd, 1937. I'll never forget that day. We got into a car and came out, and my mother said, we're going to a place called Northampton, which nobody in my family knew existed, or where it was. And we had to come by the old Route 9, which seemed an interminable route, in which we passed, I thought, thousands of cows coming out here, in every hill and every dale and that's how I remember we got here, and so we were in a furnished house on furnished rooms in 30 Butler Place with a Jewish family. Name was Goldman, and he was a furrier. And so now we're getting into the type of thing where the Jews could come through, that they had a skill. And so it was on the 2nd floor, and the furs were, were in 1937, people wore fur coats. And there was another Jewish furrier named Herman Miller, who kind of interned with, I guess, the Goldman, and then later he went into business for himself, only he wasn't on the second floor, he advanced and got on the first floor, and he had fur coats in the window, you know, and was more interested, I think, in selling fur coats than in repairing them, but I guess they did repair work and storage. Now I think, but I only know from hearsay, that Assman was a furrier. That's a name I think I've heard of, this from Springfield, who was also a furrier and may have preceded Goldman. So the point being that they came through with skills that they could have learned, even if they weren't academic skills, they were the hands. So the first room we lived in was in Butler Place, and it was next door to a man named Sam Michelman, who had Northampton Loan and Finance Company. And there was no commercial loan companies around. It was either a bank or this private plan, and I guess he ran it, and he was on the second floor. And he was very, very, very instrumental and very influential in Democratic politics. He had two nieces who lived with him, Francine and Esther Fink, and I guess their mother had died, and Sam Michelman's wife was their aunt, and so they lived with their aunt and uncle next door to where I was, and I was probably the only two Jewish people I knew in the whole city. And so the Hebrew school from Butler Place was just not that far, it was a block away. And so I was 9, so my parents were kind of concerned about crossing streets and all that stuff. That's when you have to pass this Polish church with the Zedek business. But then we moved up, and I had a little bit in here about the shul that we have already talked about, what wasn't in the best of condition.
Let me ask you about the merchants. I'll ask you now with the shul. Didn't they have to open up on Saturday, the merchants?
Yeah.
So they didn't go to shul on Saturday morning?
Well, some did and some didn't.
Was that an issue, do you remember? For the Orthodox rabbi?
It was, but I think it was resolved in some way like this. If your name was August and you had Ann August and it was quite large, and you could have leave people in your employ and you could go to shul, that was one thing. But then the people who weren't that well off said, well, I have to close my store down if I go. And so I can't afford to do that. And so it might have been an issue, but it was kept kind of, because you had this understanding that always, like some people, well, it's fine, the shul is downtown, and most people can walk there from where you live. But I have to either get transportation and not go at all, so it's better to get transportation than not go. And the same idea being that if you have a business and you can leave your employees to run it, and you can go, you're fine, you're a gentleman. But if my business is so small, I can't afford to, then I can't afford to lose. He's still my competitor.
You would normally get minions on Shabbos in the 30s and 40s? Was that a problem?
Yes.
You would.
That's where I came in as a Vilda hire.
You would attend?
I'd have to. That was obligatory. Well, if you want to be bar mitzvah.
But afterwards?
Well, afterwards, the deal was, you do this every single day. You do this. You put on the fill-in. You do all the stuff. You go through. You have your bar mitzvah. And the thing was, my bar mitzvah was on a Saturday in the shul, but the big party was in the Hotel Northampton on Sunday, when my mother could invite all her relatives from Cambridge. And
who remained Orthodox?
No, they had this varying degree. I mean, as I said, it started with Aunt Rebecca, who might have been Orthodox, and even my grandfather, who said he played by ear. Whatever house he was in, he would pretend it was Orthodox. So there was a descending thing all the way down. The sister next to my mother was as unorthodox as my mother could be. I mean, my mother got to the point where we have separate dishes for Passover, pink glass things, but and she might light candles. But we had really watered way down from where Aunt Rebecca would have been.
What do you think happened to your parents that occurred?
To my parents, vis-a-vis
Observance.
what have they? Well, I think they. My mother always said, "Well, Grandpa said," and what Grandpa said is if Moses said it, is when they were in Europe or when they were traveling, whatever it was, they had these kosher laws because they weren't sure about at the bottom of the sea, those things that they crawl around, they're no good, and pigs eat garbage, they're no good. And so but in this country where you have a FDA, things are better, so we can write these things off, And so we wrote most of them off, And I mean, to this day, Charlotte and I, what's the only thing we don't eat is pork. I mean, and the guys would look at me in the Kiwanis Club because they serve.
Which club?
Kiwanis. I was in the Kiwanis Club. In fact, I became, after a while, president of the Kiwanis Club. But you go to the Hotel Northampton, and they serve a meal. And so I'd come around, and the guys would see some of the other Jewish members see, well, he's eating they might have ham and pineapple or liver and bacon, and no problem. But when they come around with the pork, with the stuffed pork, with the stuffing in the middle, it looks like it's drenched in fat, and I just couldn't see it.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say to the waitress, "Yeah, I really can't have it."
See, this is treif.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she, oh, I'm sorry. And they go off and they get me hamburger or something like that.
Let's continue with Main Street. I think you would.
Yeah, I was getting to that.
People.
So, I started down where I lived, and I was working up Main Street, where the show was located on Bridge Street. At the very Bridge Street actually turns into Main Street at about where that overpass is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I also should have mentioned, I guess previous to the show, when they bought the Episcopal Church, they used the Masonic Hall. And they rented it. Right now there's a second congregation, as you know, starting in Florence, and they rent the Florence Congregational Church. So they rented apparently the Masonic Hall.
The one near the police station.
I think there was one before that. I think it's near the police station, but I always thought Lower Main Street preceded this because this goes back a while. And here's where I mentioned the balcony where the women were segregated, and building had seen better days and all that stuff. And the Hebrew school business, and so finally we started up Bridge Street on my meandering up that way, and the first store down there was Ruby's, which is a furniture store, and at that time it was a big furniture store, and they were owned by Jews, but I think they came from Holyoke, because originally some of the Jews might be a nice place to work, but they didn't want to live here with nobody else, just a few Jews. So they really drove in, a commuter type of a deal.
Mm-hmm. You know what their names were, the Ruby people?
No, I asked. In fact, one of the ones I collaborated with on this was, I mentioned, the Bernice Clodney, who was in my class of 45. So I asked her, and Rita Fogel. Now, Rita Fogel helped me with some of these things, and Rita Fogel just died.
Mm-hmm.
And I had spoken to her about this just about 2 months before she died.
Mm.
And she said, well, I don't know if I'll make it to the meeting we had, but I'll try. And so we got to the meeting, and she wasn't there.
Mm.
And I thought, well, then she came in and said, I would have been here on time, but I had trouble with my car. I didn't say she had any other problem.
Mm.
So Rita helped me a little bit with this, and so did Bernice Clodney, and her husband Stan, who was one of the original people in town, Stan Greenberg, isn't feeling too good, so she's not that reliable in coming to these meetings. But she did show up, but Stan couldn't because he was sick. So the next store coming up Main Street was Budgar Drug. Now, that was operated by Louis Budgar, later Leonard Budgar. And again, pharmacy was one of the things that in the early days of pharmacy, you were able to fit in your schedule and work. It isn't like you commit yourself to 4 straight years. The Mass College of Pharmacy, it was that period of time, but you could always get a job working in a drugstore and say, you know, I get Tuesday off, I do this, I have a class, and they would always work their way through. So among the things that were on Main Street were some, on Main Street was Louis Budgar, Morris Sender was up in Florence, Leo Shalinsky was in East Hampton, there was the one from Louis Levin was in Blank Levin, which was on Lower Main Street. All pharmacists who managed, that's the one kind of a profession that could get in because the scheduling is elastic enough that you can work nights and Sundays and Saturdays and still go and then come and start a business with limited funds. Now you could never, ever, ever, ever start a drugstore now with the limited funds we have because of things like CVS that come in.
What about was it Maurice Bond?
Yeah, Mo Bond.
Was he a pharmacist?
Yes, he was. But they came in after the war. We're talking, they showed
We'll
up
get there. Okay.
1949 or so. Then there was Jack August on across the street, on Main Street coming up. I think they were like 5 Bridge Street.
And what did Jack August have?
Jack August was fish. He started out, it was takeout fish. You know, they would go in and you'd say, I want 3 pieces of haddock or whatever, French fries, they'd have it ready, you'd go out. It was inexpensive, fish was cheap, a quick meal. Then as he got into it, he got his entrepreneurial skills going, and he even happened to be a great cook. And they said, well, why don't you buy the land next door and knock down where the garage is and build a restaurant. So it started out just supplying fish. Then he got into the restaurant business, and finally his son Howard, who went to, I guess he went to University of New Hampshire, graduated, was in the Army overseas, came back, and he was going to carry on the business. And in the meantime, he had a heart attack and died, and his wife carried it on until just recently.
Were the Augusts known in town as being Jewish?
Oh, yes.
Everybody knew they were Jewish.
Oh, everybody, without a doubt. I mean, because there were so many of them. I mean, there's like, they probably constituted 20% of the Jewish population. There was Jack August, so I mentioned that. And then there was, at the beginning, Morris Gould came in. He had a furniture store, which was Lower Main Street. And he was, Lillian Gould was his wife, and she was just as active in it as he was. And I mentioned Bernice Clodney. She was in my class of 45, and the one who's still around. She's be 81 like I am. He was at, he had a furniture store, and I think it was like 3 Main Street. Very low Main Street, very low numbered Main Street, right actually adjacent to where the railroad station, where the railroad tracks cross. There's now a parking lot next to Fitzwillies. Where that parking lot is, used to be where Clodney set up his furniture store. Prior to that furniture store, there was a feed and grain store, because when the railroad used to go through, they didn't have that many bakeries that made Wonder Bread and all that stuff. So people more or less did a lot of their own baking, and they did have flour and wheat and everything came in, and that's where it came in, and the restaurants got it, and they distributed it from there. Then when that went out, Bernice Clodney moved in from Springfield and set that thing up, and that went. And then Harry Daniels was across the street, just up after where Jack August was on the same side. There's a corner now. There's two restaurants on the corner of Strong Avenue and Main Street. There's a large store. It was a man's apparel store. So again, and it was the probably the principal man's furnishing store in Northampton for years and years and years. They had a big clock out inside on the sidewalk with the name Harry Daniels on it. And the one who operated that was Ralph Lovey Sr. And of course they were reformed, so his two sons were, that I knew were my class, was Ralph Lovey Jr. and his twin Bernie. But since they were reformed, they weren't in the they weren't in my Young Judean Club or anything. And I haven't seen them too much until lately. They show up at our meetings that we have on, so Ralph was here. Then there was a curtain shop that was at 29 Main Street. It was operated by Joshua Bernstein. And now those things change hands, but the curtain shop moved from one Jewish family to another. Not by virtue of inheritance or anything, but way afterwards, when I was already back from the service and opened my own store, Jasper Danziger owned the curtain shop way up high where the bank is now, kind of in that area, and that's where he was. But somehow a curtain shop had been in Jewish hands ever since, until he sold out and it went across to where it's in Thorns Market now. Cohen Brothers was at 33 Main Street. And again, that was a more or less women's clothing. I don't think there was men's clothing, and it was more or less women's.
What was their name? Do you remember the
Cohen? Yeah,
first
it was
name?
Cohen. For Milton and Bob.
Those
Yeah.
are the sons. but
The sons. The
Who was
first
father?
I've forgotten what the first name was.
Okay.
Of the father. But the sons went into it, and Bob Cohen went off. I guess he went to, he had a brother too, and they both, I think, either went to Yale or someplace. And Bob was in the clothing business for a while, and I guess he saw the writing on the wall and decided this isn't going to last too much longer. And they're going out to the shopping centers and so forth. And so Cohen Brothers later moved from this location on Lower Main Street up to Upper Main Street, in the middle of Main Street, just about where, say, Thorns being the 100% location, Cohen's moved up there. And then later he left to his brother Milton. Bob said, I can earn a living being a teacher, and I think he went off to be a teacher in Deerfield or something like that. And his wife, Ruth, was a teacher in Northampton High School. And also in the same location at 36 Main Street was Greif's Department Store. Greif's Department Store was a kind of a small department store that you'd laugh off the wall now, but you know, it had pots and pans and I guess all kinds of things like a small department store, but I don't think the whole store is more than 1,000 feet. Now we're talking about stores that go 135,000 feet. So all these stores that I say were initiated by people who could buy things at wholesale and sell at retail and hand on to their sons have gone, and those sons have gone off to college and become something else. Now the one member of that Greif family was Oscar Greif, who was a lawyer, who went nights, which was another thing you could do if you didn't have the money to go 4 years to Harvard Law and 4 years to Harvard and 3 years to, you could go nights. And I guess they had a law school in Springfield, and Oscar went nights and he became a lawyer. And he later bought out, he went into the office where Calvin Coolidge was. So it always said Hemingway and Coolidge, but Oscar Greif was in there. And then Oscar Greif himself became the district attorney in Northampton.
Jewish.
Yeah, and he was in the Kiwanis Club with me, and we used to talk about it. He married his secretary and didn't really pursue his Judaism that much.
He was in the same practice, did I understand you right, with Calvin Coolidge?
Not at the same time.
Oh.
Calvin Coolidge's
Scott.
office became vacant, and it had a door on it that said Coolidge and Hemingway. And Oscar says, "I'll take it." And so he went in there. And if you want Oscar Greif, he was in the office where Coolidge was. Not to mention Coolidge was there 40 years ahead of him, whatever.
And he had been president by then, too.
Yes, he'd been president by then, but it didn't.
And he was
help.
Mayor. Can you remember him being mayor?
No, I can't remember.
That's before
his
your
mayor.
time.
No, but I know my next door neighbor, when we were on Main Street, was Joe Lobello, and he had a Boston fruit store. My father had his store, and so he knew Joe Lobello very well. Joe Lobello was so proud of the fact that he had a gun permit that was signed by Calvin Coolidge. And the story he would always tell you is one day Calvin Coolidge came in the store and looked in and saw him counting up money. And he said to him, "You need a gun permit." And so he signed a gun permit for him, and he had it. That's from the mayor of Cambridge. And Grace Coolidge, the Coolidges never threw their money around, ever. And so my father in one section of the store would have toys, and sometimes those toys would get a little bit out of date or misshapen or whatever.
Damaged a little.
Damaged, and Grace Coolidge would always be in there for those toys for her grandchildren. She never wasted a dime either. In fact, she might have made Calvin look pretty spendthrifty. Then there was the Fines Army-Navy store that coming up Main Street, that was Lower Main Street. And that was, and again, here's part of the trouble. Fines did very, very well. It was like an Army-Navy store. But who can really use those stores now to an extent? But anyway, they were on the wrong, they were on not so good side of Main Street. They moved across the street, and they did well for years and years and years. One of the problems was that Fine himself died, and the daughter, his wife, carried it on, and she did very well. But it was left to a son and a daughter, and one was Lucille Dansky, and Fine. And finally, Lucille Dansky died, and I guess High remarried, and her husband remarried, and I guess he wanted to move off with his new wife to Florida, and he said, "Well, buy me out," and they couldn't raise the money to buy him out, so it kind of split the business, and I guess two of the kids went off to college anyway, and there's one of them left who was still trying to run it. And there's an Army-Navy store on the way to Amherst.
There was.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's still there. That's the family?
That's
The big one.
That's the
On
that's
Route
the
9.
Fine. That's Sylvia Fine's son. Sylvia Fine, by the way, was a pharmacist, and when she married into this kind of business, and when her husband died, she took over and did very, very well running it. And that store has gone downhill anyway, and it couldn't really afford Main Street business anymore, so they had to sell the block. And Gleason Brothers took over the Army-Navy store type of deal.
Not in that location.
Not that location.
Different location.
They took it over on Strong Avenue. And just moving up the street was Blank Levin, 48 Main Street. Now Blank Levin, again, was one of these pharmacies that was established, and it was a professional type of thing, but he could earn his degree by going nights and everything else, and so he had a pharmacy, and since he had actually had experience in Europe and moved from Europe to the United States, he had old world experience in pharmacy as well. And he happened to know a lot of these Polish remedies, which Polish people brought over with them, and when he'd say such and such was the only pharmacy who could probably do it, and this day it would be illegal because of the restrictions on what you can do and what you can't do. But anyway, he could do it. And then there was a thing called Bell's Cut Rate, which was a little tiny store, would be my father's competitor, and it was the same type of a deal. It was a patent medicine store with cut prices, and it was down on Lower Main Street. And when my father opened, they said, well, you realize there's another store you're competing with, and so he knew. This man's name was Belgrade. That I don't think he lived in Northampton.
Jewish?
Yeah.
Jewish.
That's why he's listed here.
That's what I thought. Okay. Just confirming. Yeah.
Okay. And then there was, in one of the, I was trying to think of the Jewish people around, and as you see, they were all on Main Street is the point I was making. And the one or two people I could think of who weren't actually in business or in offices was a man named Ringgold, Ringold, who happened to be a salesman for Metropolitan Life. And he was, I guess, in one of the offices. And the only reason I even remember the name is he had a daughter, Elaine, who was about my age. And my mother would always have like a quarter or 50 cents. This guy would show up and take, and I said, what's he want? Well, that's your college fund. So my mother was saving up money from when I was a kid. It helped, but finally I got the GI Bill anyway, so. So then as you cross Main Street, you're going up, but there's Pleasant Street crosses it. So now we're going to take a trip up and down Pleasant Street. And there was Federal Supply, 48 Pleasant Street. That was operated by High Wolf and Sam Wolf. Now she's still in the organization. High Wolf's name is what?
Doris died.
Doris.
She died.
Did she? Oh yeah, she died.
Yeah.
Doris Wolf died.
Oh, I knew Doris.
Yeah. That was,
Her
they owned,
husband's business.
that was owned, they owned Federal Supply. And High Wolf, Sam owned it, but High also worked there as if he was a partner.
I think they were partners.
They might have been partners. And who was High Wolf's wife?
Millie.
Billy. Did she the one that married Gould? No.
No, Millie Wolf died.
Yeah, Millie Wolf died too. All these
Millie
people
died. I remember Millie, right?
Yeah.
That's my
Yeah, all
time.
these people have died, and I haven't kept track of them.
Yeah.
Rita Fogel just died
I know.
a couple of days ago, so.
Yeah.
Cohen Dry Goods was 27 Pleasant Street, and that was before I really knew him, but Bernice reminded me that Cohen Drug was good, and I think it was relation to her somehow, but I wasn't familiar with it. Now there was Tepper 5 and 10. I don't know if you remember Tepper's. The 5 and 10 cent store that's located where that inexpensive movie is on the corner. You know where the old post office is in Northampton?
Oh, the Pleasant Street Movie Theater.
Right.
Yeah.
All
They
right.
do foreign films. Yeah.
Yeah, they do foreign films, but before that, there was a place called Tepper's 5 and 10 cent store
In that building?
in that building.
I think on the corner
On
it
the
says
corner.
Teppers. It says Teppers on the building. So,
Yeah,
I think.
but it was
The whole building.
the whole building. I mean, the whole first floor
The whole first floor.
was Tepper's 5 and 10. And Don Tepper ran it, and he also had Tepper's in Florence. There was Tepper's on the corner where,
Birds?
no, on the other corner, where the
Pizza.
I guess it's a pizza thing now,
Right.
and it was, what is the one, West was there
West
for
was
you?
across the street, the other side.
West, that's where Tepper was.
That's a big building.
Yes.
And people used
Well,
to stay over there.
Yes.
Right.
Well, he had that first floor in that, and he ran him both. Now, he told me he was in the Kiwanis Club with me also, and he mentioned he was Jewish, but he married a girl who was Congregational Church, and so he kind of wasn't ever active, but he kept mentioning to me he was Jewish, and obviously his brother was too. So he had Tepper's 5 and 10 cent store.
He had competition with McCollum's. What's the name of the other store, department store?
Well, he didn't really have competition because he was a 5 and 10 cent store, so he would have competition with Woolworths and Kresge's.
There was a Woolworth and Kresge's in town?
Oh yeah,
I don't remember this. Yeah?
Oh yeah. They were I think 78 Main Street.
Woolworth is where CVS is, I think. That area there.
Right.
So he was competing with some serious department stores.
Yeah, but he had things like if you wanted notions, if you wanted sewing goods, or you wanted certain needles or whatever, his people was a smaller store and was more knowledgeable. If you ever went into Kresge's or Woolworths, they'd have a big long, like a girl would walk up and down in a contained area where she had counters all around her, like in an island, and she would be on the inside. And these girls weren't that knowledgeable, and they couldn't respond to orders that quickly as Don Tepper could. So, I mean, he served the purpose, and he was there for years and years and years. And he got more or less wiped out the way all of us people did. You either get wiped out by attrition, or your kids go up and say, I don't need this, or I don't want it, or I'm a doctor or a lawyer now, and so forth. Now, Levin Tailoring was also on Pleasant Street. There was a place called 7 Pleasant Street, and it was up above. There's an alleyway that goes through, if you go down, and there's like a place above it, and I think Al Scheinman lives there now. But there used to be Levin Tailoring, and he and a couple of sisters and so forth did all kinds of tailoring and so forth. And I think they rented tuxes and things like that. It was on the second floor. And again, this is one of these things that you don't go to college for, but it has you a certain skill with your hands, as opposed to with what they weren't allowed to do in Europe, such as owning land and being a farmer. So I can't think of very many Jewish farmers around here, but I can't think of the ones who were in these skills, were furriers, or tailoring, or trading, or whatever.
The Augusts were cattle dealers, weren't they?
Yes. But they just traded them. They
didn't raise them.
They had a field where they stayed temporarily, but that was it. And High August was a lawyer. He was one lawyer that was in town, and he was, I think, he was a graduate of MIT, and he was a lawyer. And anyway, he wasn't doing awfully well as lawyers, because Jewish lawyers. There were a lot of lawyers in town, and there were only these two that I can think of. High August.
They weren't doing well? Why?
First of all, people didn't have money.
Oh, we're talking the Depression time.
Yes,
still.
we're talking Depression. We're going back, and I'm coming up Main Street. And he, two things I remember about High. He was the president of the Shul at one time, which was unusual for a young single person. And the second thing was, when the war came along, he pointed out to the government that he was an engineer, basically. And so he was at Los Alamos. And we don't know too much what happened, but he came back in a lead coffin. There was a radiation, they had an explosion or something there.
This is High
August.
Really?
Yeah. Okay, now we got up as far as Main Street, and we went down Pleasant Street. If you go down the other way, King Street. I mentioned before, I alluded to Carlson and Badger as a big, there were junk men who went around with a horse and a wagon and did things like this man Barber. But there was people who would set up the business. I guess Ben Carlson and Bonnie Carlson's father preceded them, had gone into it, but gone into a bigger way. And they were the ones who were actually buying railroad sidings and railroad cinches that went out, so they had the metal and the scrap. Bonnie was in the Kiwanis Club with me, and he was a wheel in Democratic politics, and he's the one that helped get Dr. Brick his first job, as the welfare doctor, more or less. We didn't have it.
How far down King Street was this junk shop.
Do you know King Street at all?
Sure.
Okay. When you go, do you know where Florence Bank is?
Sure.
In King Street, across the
King
street.
and Kishman is there.
Right.
Yeah. Across the
Right.
street is a car
Across the
place.
street is a car place. That whole thing, even where the garages and everything,
Yeah.
was his Bonnie Carlson junkyard. As my cousin said to me when he came in the store, way back in the early 50s, we're going to turn your King Street into Main Street, and your Main Street into King Street, and you can get up onto King Street now if you want to.
He was preparing you for the decline of Main
Right.
Street.
Yes, he was. Also, he's trying to say, if you want to come in on
Ground floor.
here's your chance. And it wouldn't have worked out because even people who went in were squeezed out by these big chains. Now, I mentioned some of the junk dealers, and I know there was a Jacob Alinsky, because I knew all these people I knew, their kids, not they were in my class, but they were in either my Young Judean Club or behind me, or I heard of them. And so there was a Jacob Alinsky, and there was a Philip Allen, who was the junkyard that's up there now.
Philip Allen, is this
Yeah.
related to the younger Allen, the junk business in East
Yeah,
Hampton?
be his grandson.
Uh-huh. The Allen brothers.
Yeah,
So
That's
the
his
original
grandson.
one wasn't,
the original one.
oh, it was
and
Philip, and he
yeah,
died,
right.
and then his son.
Then the one that took over that married.
And
Ed.
Allen.
No. The one that married.
Oh, yeah, but was his Philip, was it?
No, I don't think so. Anyway,
Ed Allen
this
is the one who's around now.
Yes,
right?
yes. So
Yeah.
this is this is he and his brother. These are
Right, who retired to
grandsons.
Florida.
Right. These are grandsons.
And Elliot Allen, does that name ring any bells? He just passed away in Springfield. He was in August, so the Allens were August
Yeah,
too.
well, I remember reading it and I couldn't connect it up. When I spoke here, I said, I called Rita Fogel and I said, you're in August. I need you to help me straighten out these Augusts because I can't get them all straight.
Right.
And I knew Jack August had a brother, Harry, who had a grocery store down on Con Street.
We haven't gotten there yet.
No, we haven't
Okay.
gotten there. But there was a Sam Allen who was in the junk business. And there's a Bert Michaelman who was at 41 William Street. And a David Feldman. So, and Barber. So, I mean,
And which
there were-
one?
Barber, B-A-U-V-E-R. He was the one who was a shamus also. So all these things, what I was trying to really come to is many of these businesses and things that were set up by immigrants who came here. There was no, you couldn't go to get any kind of a welfare assistance or anything like now. Now, in my pharmacy, I'd have people who had just come in from Puerto Rico Saturday night, Sunday morning, they'd be in the store with a Medicaid thing. There was no such assistance for these people.
It was sink or swim.
Right. And so it usually depended on some member of the family having been here first, secured a foothold, and then managed to act as a second foothold for them to come into.
Well, on this point, would you say the Jewish community, that people helped each other?
I don't know
Someone
if
was
they
in
helped it. I
distress.
think I'm not sure that the community did, or the family itself. Such as in my family, it wasn't the Cambridge community, it was the Bennett Family Corp that set up, that actually made a deal to get this. My grandfather would say, get $200 to this guy and he'll get his family here. That kind of deal. Then as you continue up Main Street from Pleasant Street, on that side of the street where you knew where the Woolworths used to be, or where CVS is now, was Berger's clothing store. Again, it's a women's clothing store. Gert Berger was, I don't know if you knew Gert. Gert's about, she just died. She died a few years ago. She's about 5 years older than I was, 7 years older. She had a brother, Bert, and both of them grew up in that business with Louis Berger, and his father was Louis Berger, and they had that store. I guess Pinocchio's there now. Pinocchio Pizza Place. They had 3 stores. They had a bargain basement, a first store, and a second store.
All clothing?
All clothing, all women's clothing, no men's
All
clothing.
Cohen Brothers.
Yeah, so I mean,
A burger.
Burger.
See, I don't know what you'll have to tell me as we, what years all these stores went out, because that's not clear.
Well,
We're talking the 30s, how long they lasted till.
oh, they lasted until into the 80s anyway.
Do you think most of the stores we've described so far lasted?
Well, Greif's went out early. I'll tell you later when they went out. But Louis Berger's store,
I came in 1963, and I certainly remember burgers for quite a while.
and she was an active customer, and Louis Berger was a customer. Louis Berger was one of the Kiwanis clubs, was in the Kiwanis club preceding me, which I think I mentioned, that we realized that the Kiwanis club really had a lot of Jewish members. The Rotary Club had a lot of Jewish members. The Lions Club did not. Lions Club had 0. And they said, don't even think of the Lions Club because you won't get in. So then years later someone mentioned it's on account of so-and-so who happened to be a pharmacist on Main Street who was blind. You can have, and usually you can blackball somebody in these things. You can be on a committee or whatever and say, he wouldn't fit in here. And that happened. And one time, as far as Lions went, a very, very prominent man came in who was had been the president of a Lions Club someplace else, and he also came in to run Felt Supply or whatever down on, and so he had, and he knew from nothing, so he applied, and he got in. So as far as I knew, he never wondered how come I'm the only one, but he was. All right, the reason I would have mentioned Peter Rose is we came down August. And it struck me that one of the reasons I mentioned it is Peter Rose was in the store. One of the reasons Ann August couldn't continue, amongst other, is that Charles August was one of the sons of Alexander August. He went off and was accepted at Harvard Medical School and graduated as a physician. So he's not going to come back and run a women's clothing store.
Uh-huh.
Another member of that was, who was one that went off to Yale, Bender. Bender was another member of the August family. There were 5 sisters in the August family. There was Al August, the brother, and there's Lee and so forth. I can't name them all off the top of my mind. But 2 of those sisters married, and Al August was the one who was the accountant in the whole deal. And he figured out that when the war was over, his son-in-laws were going to come back out of the service and they were going to need jobs. And these sisters who had been working in the business with Ann, she started out as a seamstress and did nothing but repair clothing. She was killed in an accident in which they had double indemnity. I think they got something like $20,000. $20,000 in the height of the Depression meant a lot of money. So suddenly a seamstress could turn into a clothing store. The clothing store could say Ann could say, you people come back, you're an accountant, I need someone to do this, and we'll buy big, and we'll buy in Boston. And anyway, they bought a block on Main Street, and it became Ann August. And Ann August was a staple on Main Street for years, next to McCallum's, who had a front page, an ad on page 2 of the Gazette. Ever since I could remember, the whole page 2, McCallum's always had an ad. Well, sure as enough, Al August and August department store had an ad too on page 3. There wasn't a whole page, there was 2 columns long and the whole page long. Always you could depend on seeing Ann August. And so, of course, Bender was one of the men who married one of the sisters, and they had a son, and he went to Yale Medical School. So now you got two of the sons who might potentially run into own any other business or inherit it. They're physicians, and they're not coming back. Charles August's sister, she went and majored in, I think, French and French literature, and she went off in France. She's not coming. In other words, the point I was asking Peter, and he said, well, that's happened in all little towns, and they said it when I was talking, that the families came in with limited, with only their hands to work with, somehow worked up enough equity that they insisted the one thing that happens is that kids go to college. Kids go to college, they don't want any of this business. They're not Burgers, not August, not Coen Brothers, none of them want to come back and do this, but it doesn't matter much anyway, because by this time the retail stores, as we know it, mean nothing on Main Street anymore. These small retail stores with the hardware store, with the clothing store, with the women's store, with everything is gone. My store is gone, with the drugstore. CVS is my place. Photo Supply is gone. All those things are gone. So these kids went off just in time. Now they're back as corporate managers and whatever. So anyway, that's how I happened to get into Peter Rose at this point when I was talking about August, because you wonder whatever happened to Ann August when they were the star of the community on Main Street. They were the engine driving the block, the whole thing. And it's because the kids in all of these stores go off someplace. Danziger is another example. The curtain shop I mentioned, the Cedar Chest. Jasper Danziger sold off, and it went across the street, and Thorne's wife bought the Cedar Chest. And Danziger wouldn't have come back anyway because he went to Dartmouth Medical School. So most of these kids took off to professional schools or law schools and would never come back anyway. But even if they could have come back, these stores would have been sold or had no viable way of going on. So going up Main Street on the same side that Ann August was a store that you mentioned, Mo Blanc. Well, they bought out Dickinson later on, but this is, up to now I'm talking mostly...
1930s, late 30s?
Hmm?
Late 1930s.
Yeah, well, I was talking late 1930s, I'm talking, to me, in my life, the war is a deciding thing. When the war ends and we come back, not 1945, but 1952, is a deciding point. Before that, my father, all the people ran the place. Then the kids came back or not come back, as the case may be. But prior to, say, about 1947, 48, in there after the war, because all three of the boys were in the war, they came back and they were pharmacists, and they brought out Dickinson Drug, which was established 100 years ago. As a matter of fact, I have the pharmacy book that one of the owners of Dickinson gave me, Mrs. Cutter, was a customer of mine. And she used to come in the store. She was president of the DAR, and her grandson was the last member captured in the Korean War and released. She said, Norman, I want you to have one thing. It's my grandfather, somebody had this book. He was drowned, he died. I have it. I want you to have it. So I've been working on that thing for a long time, looking at some 250 of these old pharmacy recipes, where they started, what they did, could they have done anything, and where did they get them, because some of them are Roman, they're Galen, some of them go back to Hippocrates, some of them I don't pick them out of the sky, whatever it is, and what they actually did with it. This is getting off the point, but it was, some of them, a lot of them were the Viagra of the day, where the men would come in and just say, I haven't got the energy I used to have. And I've got all these remedies of what they were doing, which involved from everything from Nux Vomica to you can't mention it. So anyway, that's getting off it, but the Barnes came in after the war, which is a little bit after this period, but that was a Jewish pharmacy, so we had, a number of pharmacists, because that was the type of a thing you could go to a professional school for 3 years or 4 years, sometimes working at night or whatever, and pass the boards and go in, as opposed to some of them who were just here on the trades. Either they were just merchants or they were actually tailors or cobblers or whatever. All right, so as we're going up the street, we come to Kittredge. Kittredge was owned from the Kittredge family in Springfield. and they came up and they were on the corner where the photo shop is now. It was Kittredge for a long time.
Kitchenware.
Yeah, but I think it's another member of the family, because this was jewelry. This was straight jewelry. Jewelry, and it was like, and the man who ran it for them was a man named Schindler, who lived next door to us on Belmont Avenue. And he was Jewish, but he legally kept his name Schindler, but he used the word Sherwood all the time. So it must have been confusing for him, but that's what happened. And across the street from where Dickinson was, and where Kathy Cross is now, actually, was Northampton Public Market, which was owned by Nathan Kaplinsky from Springfield. And the one who ran it here was named Merkin. And that girl, Marilyn Merkin, went to Smith College, and she went off, so she was never going to get involved in this. The Cedar Chest.
What kind of public market was it?
Northampton Public Market was about as big a grocery store as you're going to see, but as the days when we were first talking, there was very few, there was nothing on King Street, nothing. People came in from Goshen and Chesterfield and whatever, did their shopping
On Main Street.
On Main Street. And the grocery stores, Curran Brothers, Northampton Public Market, I can name about 6 grocery stores just on Main Street, besides Market Street and Center Street and so forth. But this was one of those stores, and if you look at it now, it's where Kathy Cross is, and it's where you have these steps that go up on Main Street. You know, you can.
Oh yeah, what's that about?
Well, if you notice, the main street slopes down, and they do the same thing down where in front of Harry Daniels. The street slopes, so you've got stairs, but they made it so you can go down. So I mean, we've had this all over. In fact, in my store, which I later bought, I bought Dickinson, and that's where my store was, Brandwin Pharmacy, which we sold to CVS. Okay, so
What was the street address?
of my store, originally, my first they had a hole in the wall, the Draper Hotel, and then they had 233
Main Street.
Main Street, and then when we bought out Mo Bond, it became 144 Main Street. And now, to just jump ahead 60 years, my son, who may walk in momentarily, is a lawyer, and the one thing I have left in my building is I rented the second floor to my son, so
He has an office.
he has an office there.
You still have the
The
building?
same building.
You still have the building?
Yeah. I just sold them the pharmacy, and then after I sold them the pharmacy, about 1 week later, the whole Woolworth thing collapsed. And now they suddenly realized they had a lease with me, but they would really like that.
No, well, no, a bank wanted
Yeah, I know.
to come. They approached CVS, the bank wanted to come on Main Street, our
Yeah.
size was the perfect size, and so they made a deal, we had nothing to do with it.
We didn't know.
So we really did not know. CVS went down to the Woolworth building, and the bank, at that time it was Bay Bank. And somebody called us one day, the thing was all done.
It was all
So
done
where
on the...
CVS is now
It was Woolworth.
Was-
is your building?
No.
No, it's where the bank is now.
It was my
Bank
building
of
is where the
America.
bank is, Bank of America. Because what I
You
had
mean it's a
done,
little...
I had sold-
Bank of America was Brandwin Pharmacy.
I don't know where that
It's
is.
next to
Next to
Thorns.
Thorns.
Right next to Thorns.
Oh,
Next to Thorns, Bank of America.
that's your
now.
building.
yeah.
Yeah. And
That's
our
pretty-
son is, circle things.
Well,
He's
I mean,
got an
that
office
was-
on the
that
front
was,
overlooking Main Street,
That
a
was
little office.
Dickinson Pharmacy. Mo Bond and Al Bond and Joe Bond sold it to me. Finally, push came to shove, and I sold it to CVS. And CVS.
You sold the business, but not the building.
Right, I sold the business. They don't want buildings; they want businesses. They rent it, and they come in, and
They went to the,
they were
So
not.
you're renting to a bank now,
yeah.
Yes,
and your son, and who's in the next floor?
But the second floor, there are 3 offices, and one of them is our son.
The front office
Yeah,
is
front,
Jimmy.
and there's 2 other.
Oh, there's only 2 floors?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, actually, there's 2 floors below ground too,
Well, but
which
they're
is
not
something
commercial.
else. I was coming to it because Main Street slopes, and you kind of look puzzled when I say steps going up and down. It's because Main Street's really built on a hill, and where we are, 144 is like the top of the hill, and it slopes down for Old South Street. So we have one big cellar, and then another cellar under it, and they compensate all over the place with stairs and everything else. So, I mean, that's how we just got off the subject momentarily. Then the Cedar Chest, to cross the street, you know, where Northampton Public Market was, where Kathy Cross now is, was a Cedar Chest at that time, which was owned by Jasper Danziger and his wife, and they had 2 boys, and I mentioned those boys went off and graduated Dartmouth Medical School, and so they're teaching in a medical school someplace now. There's a number of kids who went off and are now went to medical schools, which wouldn't even have been possible before the war, because you couldn't get into medical schools if you were a Jew, unless you were the top one and they couldn't say no for some other reason. So then on the same side of the street there was a place named Bibbs Shoes. Bibbs, B-I-B-S, and his name was Gordon. I've forgotten his first name. And they were really from Springfield. And he specialized in cancellation shoes.
Oh, I remember that.
Which-
Cancellation shoes.
What are cancellation shoes?
Cancellation shoes are seconds or something like that. Now the one I mentioned, we had one relative, I think started out as a cobbler and bought one bought one machine from National Shoe Company and ended up with a shoe manufacturing company. Well, they sometimes start with one thing and with business acumen build it into another. For example, the person who did my pharmacy over one time, his father was just a craftsman, and the 2 boys went off to engineering school and came back and became interior designers. So these are how they changed. The first generation were tradesmen or whatever, but skilled. I mean, somehow from Europe, they didn't let them own land to do anything else, but they had certain skills which they could use.
They could transport them.
Right. Now, next to that was, I mentioned Asman Furs when I was talking about the furriers, which was another thing. I think the first one in town was Asman, who was here before we were.
How do you spell that?
A-S-T-M-A-N. Now, I think they were from Springfield, and one of the buildings still says Asman on it. But I think Hy Goldman, it was Hyman Goldman, who was the first furrier that I said that we lived with when we moved here.
Right.
Had a big house, and he was a furrier, and he learned it in the old country, and he had this big house on Butler Place, which during the Depression they needed extra money, so they rented out rooms, and there was a Jewish realtor who put the whole deal together. His name was A.B. Allen, who was an Allen, and he was in real estate. And A.B. Allen, I was surprised when I was looking at the directory, actually had an office, because we always used to joke, A.B. Allen does not have an office, because you'd see him walking up and down Main Street 24 hours a day, and they would joke, A.B. Allen is on Main Street, but he really had an office off here someplace on, I think it was on Pleasant Street. Anyway, Miller Fur was also a Jewish furrier that lasted for some time, and his wife went into like real estate, Roseanne Miller, and she was selling real estate. But
When you say that someone was a furrier, does that mean that he had a shop
Yes.
in the back where he would
yes,
make the furs,
yes.
and in the front where he would sell them?
And that, well, as I said, when
Or was it like going to the tailor?
The first thing I was saying, when Hyman Goldman did it, he was on the second floor, and he was principally repairing and building and whatever you have to do to furs. He took in Herman Miller. Herman Miller was younger, and I guess he was an apprentice, and he did repair work, but his principal money came from selling them. So he took a store location on the first floor, and he had furs in the window, and he would repair those things.
Not his own designs.
No, I don't think he did his own.
It was fashionable for women to wear furs.
Oh,
At this
yeah.
What
time.
period is this?
Oh, I don't know.
When I got married in 1963, I remember Herman Miller, right?
Yeah,
Miller furs.
I'm yeah. Roseanne Miller.
And Roseanne Miller, I remember very well. And it was established, and everybody had fur coats then. And if they would save up till they could afford to buy one.
Well, my mother's son.
What did it cost?
Well, I know downstairs we're still having an argument. We have a coat that I remember it was back before the war, and my mother had been saving her money. And finally she said to my father, you know, I've saved all this money, and I know we need it in the store, but I always wanted this coat. So I think it was $600. And it was a
lot then.
it was a lambskin coat.
Persian lamb.
Persian lamb,
yes,
whatever,
that
I
was
don't know.
fashionable. It wasn't mink, but
Yeah,
it was
then
fashionable.
she had it cut down afterwards. I think the one we have now has been cut
It's in
like a
cedar
jacket
chest,
style.
and I can't throw it out.
So anyway, I can't bear to throw it out because I know what it meant to her. But it was that time, was in the 30s, that I know about. She talks about this. And
No, through the 50s,
yeah,
the fur was still fashionable.
Roseanne Miller was the one that said to me, I hear you're getting married. What's the girl's name now?
What's
So
the
I
girl's
said,
name now?
Yeah, before she's married. So I said, Charlotte Rosenthal. So she says, well, Charlotte Winston. Yeah, that sounds right. So she thought that was a fashionable name. I never forget how she valued and figured the name
Did you
out.
discuss his name?
What's that?
How he got his name? She wants to know, how did you get the name Winston, the family?
Well, I'm sure my mother's family adapted it from...
Bennett.
They were Bennett,
Right.
and I'm sure they adapted it from a
Russian name.
Russian name.
How about Winston?
And I'm sure my family must have along the line done the same thing. So
But you don't know what the name was before it was Winston.
I can imagine they shortened it.
You don't have any papers that show you anything.
No. Because they would have done this, and the Bennett family was well known, and Winston was in those days my mother always said they didn't want to change religion, but they would change the name. Herman Miller took it one step further, but then we're coming to the same point that I started with Peter Rose. His furrier business is gone, his kids went to college. They weren't going to come back in the fur business anyway. August kids weren't going to come back in the women's clothing business. Cohen brothers they were teachers, and so forth. My daughter's a pharmacist, but she practiced for about 10 years, has a couple of kids, and says she doesn't want to do both.
Where does she live?
In Needham.
What's her name?
Jane Blauvelt.
Blauvelt.
Yeah.
Dutch.
Your son's a lawyer. What's his
son's
name?
James Bennett. And that's named after my grandfather, the one that started this whole project, that came over from Russia from 1980, so it must be 140 years ago. His name, as I said, was
Winston.
Yes.
His name was Yakutiel,
Yeah.
and they called him Ulysses.
Right. When they adapted the names, I was saying that the closest name they could think of to that name was Ulysses. So he became James Ulysses Bennett. Now it became my turn as the last one in a family of 10 children, and the last one to have children. I told Charlotte that I owe it to my grandfather. We're going to have James Ulysses Bennett Winston. She knocked out the Ulysses.
What's his Hebrew name?
What's this Hebrew?
I don't know. We knew about mitzvah. He may know. We knew at the time.
The furriers. Okay.
And how they start with one thing. In the case of Miller's, for example, Barry Miller went on. He's not going to be a furrier. He went to college, and and all the kids we went back Their fathers may have been on Main Street, where 90% of our people were in this town. And when I talked to Peter Rose, he said, "What's so unusual about that? That happens in my town too." And he started to talk about it. When I said this at the show, I mean, this is because
Senior lunch.
Senior lunch, Janet Freidstern heard it, and some other people came over, and 2 or 3 people came over and said the same thing in my town. You know, where it's not unusual, and I was speculating on something that happened. Well, on Main Street also was a place called the Clearweave. It was right next to my father's store, one of the smallest stores, and the man's name was Strauss. And I remember he had a very pretty daughter, and she went to Smith. And that was a store. She was going to get married, and she was never going to come back to Main Street. And then there was the Bootery, which was owned by David Lipshire's, and he owned the Bootery and David's.
Is the Bootery next to Thorne still? That Bootery? It's called
No. That's the boot shop. That's boot shop.
Where was the Bootery?
The Bootery was at my dad's store before we moved was 233, so that would have had to be something like 223. It was just before that. And
What is there
It's on the
now?
side of the street.
What is there now?
The Joey
I
Hanoush.
think
Oh, yeah.
Jewelry.
One of those stores.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's a smaller
There's
shop,
2
yeah.
stores. Lipshire's eventually bought 2 shoe stores, moved them next to each other. One was essentially women's shoes called David's. The other one was the Bootery, which he bought later from a man named Pat Montague. Pat Montague was the one who was instrumental in establishing WHMP right after the war. HMP was a Northampton station to begin with. It was Northampton and Holyoke, and then it kind of moved away. Anyway, he bought the building, and then he bought the whole race block, which was a block owned there, so he had 3 stores. One of those 3 stores was my father's store, which was, at that time, was we called it a Winston Pharmacy. Then there was David's and the Bootery. And the David and the Bootery were linked together in the back, so you could go from one store to the other, so the help could go back and forth. But the shoes were different lines and so forth. Leonard Alberts, who was a lawyer, who went to Yale, who graduated Amherst College and went to Yale Law School, was essentially selling shoes during the Depression. These lawyers who were Jewish that came back really couldn't earn a living. Okay, so wait a minute. So we got up to Miller Furs, and then we got up to the block that had David's boot store,
Right.
David's boot store, and a
Right.
Bootery.
Right.
And my father's store was there. That was Winston Pharmacy. And then also the Alberts I mentioned was a large family in Northampton. It was David Lipshire's married one of the Albert sisters.
Oh.
All right, so there was Minnie, her name was Alberts, and there was Leonard Alberts, and there was Milton Alberts, and there was another girl who married a guy named Steinberg, and there's the other one who married the one who owns State Line potato chips. Manhan potato was State Line in Springfield. I know because he had a beautiful daughter that I took out. And again, here's the potato chip company. His daughter that I took out had gone up to and graduated college in Cleveland. It was a Cleveland, I've forgotten the name. It was a women's division of Cleveland.
What was her name?
It's the name of who owns
Right.
he owns State Line potato chip. I've forgotten what the heck the name. I found the house. It was a palatial house. God, I'd never walked into a house with a girl that lived in a house like that. But anyway, it happened to be Minnie Lipshire's, who was an Albert's girl, who said, maybe you want to take out my niece. She's a pretty girl. She gave me the address, and I went up there, and I talked to her father, and they own State Line, and I know she went on. That's so that takes care of that business in there. But what I was coming to is there were 2 Albert stores. One was owned by Leonard Alberts, who was married to Virginia Alberts, who again had a very beautiful
Bernice
daughter.
Alberts.
Bernice.
No, Bernice, no.
This is not the same Leonard Alberts?
No, not Leonard Alberts. Leonard Alberts has a brother named Milton Alberts, who is called Red Alberts. Leonard Alberts is Leonard Alberts, who's married to Bernice.
So who are we talking
Period.
about now?
He made a mistake, Captain.
Okay.
No, but wait a minute. So I'm talking.
Milton.
I'm talking Milton.
Okay,
Right.
Milton has a wife named Virginia.
go.
They had a daughter, I've forgotten her name, but she was very pretty. She went up to the University of Indiana. She was not coming back here anyway. In the meantime, that store went under, that Albert store.
What was it? What kind of store?
Was what else? It was a women's clothing store.
Of course.
He was married to Jean Alberts. Jean Alberts married Milton Alberts. There's another Alberts sister that married a guy named Steinberg. They had a store called Alberts,
Oh, I remember.
and this guy was a rag peddler, a junk peddler, because every time they'd have a fight, one of the brother-in-laws would get drunk and call him, "You rag peddler, the only reason you're successful is you married my sister." Anyway, that Albert store turned out to be the fashion center of Northampton as far as women's clothing went.
What year?
Was when I had Winston Pharmacy, so it had to be from 1953 to 1963 anyway.
After I was still there when I got married in '63.
So up to maybe 1970.
How did it
And that
happen?
store was
Yeah.
so stylish that the way he worked it every single time, and he did it without fail, and everybody wondered how he did it. Guy who had never been in this business just happened to marry an Alberts girl who had some money. They had the block. He would close the business for about 6 weeks in the summer. Take a vacation, go to Europe, do anything. Period. Gone. And what they would do is sell off every last thing they had in stock at a reduced price. So everybody waited for an Albert sale. And that store, so there were two Albertses competing next to each other because the two brother-in-laws didn't get along.
Alberts were competing with each other.
Right.
Say, I don't remember that.
So did they go to Paris and find fashion? What did they do on that trip?
I don't know. I know the August, the ones I talked about, the ones that own August clothing store, women's clothing, they got so big on Main Street that you could pay a certain amount of money to buyers in New York who would pick what was going to be the hot things and what you should buy. And so they became like smart guys on Main Street because they knew the styles and the trends and they came in. That was one type of clothing store. Burgers ran a women's store that was like more, I guess, matronly. I don't know. It was a different thing. This guy who was Milton, there was Steinberg, he came from no place and ran this very, very, very fashionable thing that used to compete with Peck and Peck on Green Street, and some of these things that were Boston stores. Then they would actually come in and shop Green Street and this Alberts thing.
You had Peck and Peck on Green Street?
Oh,
yeah,
sure.
yeah. Feline's was here
Yes.
too. And my mother used to go in when my mother was to be a Feline's girl before she was married. And she would go in and say, I used to work for Feline's and talk with the people there. They're in the block where, across from the Academy of Music, there's a big restaurant there now.
Yep.
I don't know what kind of restaurant it is, but
Yeah.
that whole thing was Feline's.
Really?
And when Feline's started pulling back or retrenching or whatever they call it, now it's Macy's.
How much of your business on Main Street, especially the clothing business, women's, but the rest of it was dependent on Smith College girls?
Most of it. A lot of it. Not most of it, but a
Definitely Peck and Peck.
Yeah, but I'm asking generally
a good
the stores.
percentage. No, a good. That's why they moved here in the first place. Because first thing I said is, this man was traveling to, a man's name was Tillinghast from the Carroll Company. He was going through, and he said, I happened to be in town, and I noticed the Peck and Peck, and I noticed the Feline's, and I noticed a women's college there. And that would be a good place for a college that had called Carroll Cosmetics.
I did cosmetics, yeah.
So my father said, well, let's look at it. And they went out and looked at it. And then afterwards, my business was enhanced because at one point they built an infirmary just after I got out of college, and I went up to see him and pointed out that I had Smith Infirmary, and I pointed out I had credentials that I'd taken ROTC, and I did this for the Air Force, and they said, well, will you be our consultant pharmacist? And I said yes. So we had that kind of a thing with Smith, and a good part of the business at that time came from Smith because they could control where they, their prescriptions and everything else. Later, as insurances came in and that thing opened in Florence, the insurance went and people were divided up, and they could that health thing.
The health
Kaiser?
center. Yeah, Kaiser. With the pharmacy.
Kaiser.
Yeah.
And so that began to fall apart too, So Smith was a considerable part of their business for being here in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Second place, they were considerable, and there was a day, if you remember, one of my first jobs in the store is the women had two choices with Kotex. Either they cut up rags and would hang them out in the line. No, that's what happened.
No, I want to hear this. Is history.
I remember this.
They would hang them out,
Yeah.
or my father would have to say he became the largest purveyor of Kimberly-Clark, Kotex and Kleenex and that stuff, because we bought direct to get the direct 50 case price, because I can remember when 50 cases would come in. So the whole point was that it was a women's store. There was my mother and another woman and sometimes a sales girl, but in those days women would only buy these things for women. And my job was to wrap them up, because if it said Kotex they wouldn't buy it. So you had to wrap it up in wrapping paper, and I would write KR for Kotex Regular, Kotex Super, Kotex Junior. And then to top it off, although it was wrapped up, they put it in a bag. So they were only going to buy it from a woman's store. So in actuality, Smith College, they would come in there because there were women. And on top of it, my father turned the showcase around so that instead of asking for it, they could just go pick it up, and it said KR, so they know what they were doing. And that's the answer to your Smith problem.
Yeah.
What other major medications were the young women using?
Well, the things like Pamprin and Midol and those things like that. And then afterwards, after things got really rolling, when I was in Brandwin Pharmacy, birth control pills became a factor.
What was that like for these women coming in to get the pills? Can you remember? Was there embarrassment at that point?
That's the 60s.
We're talking the 60s now, right?
We're talking
It's a different era.
We're talking about a prescription.
Uh-huh.
And is my prescription ready? Yes, your prescription is ready.
I see.
I mean, you can't buy this over the counter.
Right.
So there was, no embarrassment that I knew about. In fact, after a while, when I first went into business, prophylactics were iffy. They were not really supposed to be sold over the counter, but on the idea if the pharmacist had them back in his room and someone asked for them, I was to assume it was for health conditions, to prevent
venereal disease or something.
Prevent disease. And that was the only reason. It was not to ever act as a contraceptive, because that's illegal. And as a matter of fact...
Until when?
It's in my memory, it was within the last 35 years.
1960s, I
I
believe.
mean, up to the 60s, if someone wanted contraceptives,
They didn't really enforce it. They could. It's one of these laws.
that was on the books.
If you were flagrant. And it worked like this. If you were in Hatfield, the Hatfield pharmacist there got into trouble financially because the Polish priest went to him and said, if you sell contraceptives or birth control pills, I'll tell these people in this place never to shop in your pharmacy. So there's a Polish pharmacist in the city that's like 85% Polish,
Right.
and he can't sell this. So
Ship the business to you.
yeah. So I mean, he didn't send it to me, but it came
Right.
over this way because I know we had an awful lot of
Hatfield.
Hatfield residents
Right.
who did that. So I mean, it was in effect more or less.
Uh-huh.
You know, this Alberts that I spoke about. Since I mentioned that Peck and Peck and
Filene's.
and all these were in town, Gene Alberts had an Albert store up on Green Street. I think it was called Jean's, which was a women's clothing store, which she had. So the Alberts, you know, were in this retail business to quite an extent, and it was a large family, and that's what happened.
So they were in competition with the Augusts.
Well, I say women's clothing was always a mystery to me. I think my mother tried to explain it to me once that I didn't understand. And Milton Albert or Steinberg had a kind of a clothes that people would come from Springfield or Long Meadow to wear, because nobody else would wear that. Burgers had a...
Oh, they had their specialties. I understand.
I mean, I don't know if it was just names or the age groups or what, but in Northampton, Cohen Brothers, Burgers, Alberts, the two Alberts, they were all competing on women's. The men's store was like Harry Daniels. They had men's haberdashery. It was that type of thing, you know, where clothing was a whole big deal. Drugs were next in line, hardware store, anything like that where one generation could hand it to...
Who owned the hardware store?
That was Wolf, High Wolf. Remember we mentioned Federal Supply was on Pleasant.
That was a hardware store.
That was a hardware store. And in fact, one of their customers was the show.
Oh, yeah, the show
Yeah,
bought a lot of stuff from
Yeah.
there.
We furnished
Two brothers,
Manischewitz.
High Wolf and...
High Wolf and Sam.
Yeah, Sam Wolf.
Sam Wolf.
Right.
And
Let's continue on Main Street.
okay, so as I mentioned, my father first had Carol's, then we had Winston Pharmacy, then we bought out Mo Bond, combined Brandles and Winston to make Brand Win. Brandles. Brandles was an old Yankee store that was started about 1890, and I had the business of the hospital, just about everybody else.
On Masonic Street.
And it was on the corner of Main and Masonic Street. And finally, as we could see, the drugstores were going down and down as we were competing with chains. Mo Bond came in one day and said, look, we're selling out. Why don't you and Shalaski buy our store and go in together, and you'll have 3 drugstores in one place, and you can carry on. So we carried on for another 20 years until when I sold out to CVS, I think I was like store number 1200. Now I see their advertising on TV, they're up almost 7,000. So, you know, we just couldn't stand competing against the chains anymore.
But you made a living.
Yeah, but you really had to work like hard. I mean, I had nursing homes. I was out at night. And that's why Jane didn't want to pursue it. I mean, I had nursing homes that could call anytime. Sure, it was good business. You go in and get 50 or 60 prescriptions just like that. But they expected service. Yes, this one, she wants this, they want that, they want all kinds of stuff going on. So now all I have to show for it is the building.
It's not bad.
Not bad. So let's continue.
All right, so up above me was, I mentioned Dr. Brick, E.J. Brick, who was the only doctor in town, only Jewish doctor. Now, if you look in the phone book, there's got to be 20% Jews. The Jews couldn't get into medical school at that point. In fact, he got into Middlesex. I don't know if you know Middlesex. Middlesex was...
Not accredited.
It wasn't accredited because Harvard and Tufts and Boston University couldn't see a Jewish school going in. This was really started by Jews. It was really a good school, but they could never get fully accredited. If they took the boards and passed it, okay, but that was it. And the one who bought out the campus,
Brandeis.
yeah,
Right.
that was Middlesex. And there were a lot of Middlesex doctors around, and he was one of them. And so the doctors in town, I started to say there was a hierarchy. It wasn't just anti-Semitism, because there were elite Protestants too. That building that's on the corner now of where the medical building is what is
On
it?
Elm?
264 Elm.
264
On Elm, where
on
Corp
Elm
is,
Street.
where Dr. Corp is, yeah.
Yeah, that was just after the war. Only Protestant doctors from either Brown or Harvard or Yale got into that building, and that was the Manuels and the Jennisons and so forth. They were all Cavanagh. They were all Yankee Protestant doctors, and the others had to exist on their own. Like there were three Polish doctors, Makowski, Mikowitz, and Pekela, and they weren't. They'd say hello, but on the side they might mention something that wasn't too good about them. They couldn't be all that bright because they didn't go to Harvard or Yale or Brown or Dartmouth, and so they had that going on. So it wasn't just anti-Semitism. There was a degree of
Elitism.
Class.
elitism and class and religion. I think religion was in this because it just so happened that these guys who went to these schools were all Protestant. Mostly they belonged to the Edwards Church and the First Church. And the others were the Polish Church or the St. Mary's, or Gervais was Blessed Sacrament, like that. So there was always this kind of a rivalry, and it wasn't until all suddenly these Jews started flooding in, like you have Topel and Cooley, and you can't name them all, that are around now. But after the war, which I can remember a little bit, the VAs became more active than it was. That VA hospital was set up by Calvin Coolidge after the First World War, and it was kind of like semi-quiet during wars. After the war, they realized they're going to need more, and they had to get doctors from someplace. So they got a number of Jewish doctors. Amongst them was Kaplan and a couple others that I can't remember. I know Kaplan because Steve Kaplan grew up with me. He's a couple of years younger, and he was a lawyer in town, Steve Kaplan. His father was, I think, Milton Kaplan.
No, not Milton. He was a psychiatrist.
He was a psychiatrist, and they needed him. And mostly you talk to these Jewish...
Milton?
I don't know if it was
No.
Milton.
You're talking about, you know what we're talking about.
Wife died. She was lovely. What was her name? She was just a lovely,
Fox
They lived
Farms
on
Road.
Fox Farm Road.
And Steve Kaplan had the lawyer that was on Center Street, and his brother teaches at Annapolis.
Yeah.
And so, see, most of these kids went on to college, but the Jewish doctors who did come in and who had somehow gained admittance to medical school before the war had served in the military and remembered how difficult it was to earn a living as a physician before the war, before all these health insurance plans and people couldn't pay their bills and all that kind of stuff. They said, I'll live the rest of my life out. I got credit for when I was in the service, and they did all kinds of things like that, and they provided a nice house for them up there. So they went and worked for the VA.
Right.
So those guys started coming into town. What was it? Dr. Bai was Jewish, and he was Bayer,
Right.
yeah.
So psychiatrist.
Yeah, he was a
Madeline's
Yeah.
husband?
Madeline, yeah, her
Madeline.
husband.
Louis Bayer.
Yeah.
Louis Bayer.
He was a psychiatrist up there. So there were a number of them who came in who weren't really Northampton physicians, but some of them joined into the congregation somehow. Then there were, I don't know if I mentioned Carlson's that was on Main Street. I mentioned Bonnie Carlson, and they had the junkyard. And then there was the Carlson who owned the Morris Carlson.
This is Carlson, C-A-R-L-S-O-N.
L-S-O-N. On the corner of Main and Pleasant Street. There was a long time of a a newspaper stand that was like permanent. It was like an inside newspaper stand that was there for years. Then Carlson somehow got control of that corner and put up a whole redwood exterior. So it souped it up, made it all...
Which corner? North, east? Which corner?
No, the corner of Pleasant.
Yeah, well, they have four
The
corners.
same
And-
side where Thorns is.
It's where the candy store is. Next
Yeah,
to it.
yeah, the candy.
yes.
That remained a newsstand up till recently. A newspaper
Yeah.
place.
Well, no,
that was
Not the one next to the
no,
candy store.
No, Lazard's is what you're talking about.
Right.
Lazard's was a newspaper store, but around the corner there was like a setup of racks and windows that could cover it if you went away. But if it was a good day, he would open it, and there was all these newspapers and magazines and booklets and everything. And it was there for a long time until Carlson came in. And he said, we're going to make this, a real souped-up area. And so they got rid of that thing, and they put up redwood, like redwood cedar, up and down. So a whole new front.
Is this the store that is now the candy store?
Yes, that's what Ken said. That
Okay.
one.
That's the candy store.
That's
The
the
red
candy
cedar
store.
front is gone.
Yeah.
Yeah, but see, they did a lot of that. The August, I don't know if you were here when they had that modernistic front. There were squares, about 3-foot squares. Of
In Ann August?
Yes.
Remember the pneumatic tube they had?
He's talking about something else.
But
He's
talking about the
design.
facade.
Yeah, yeah.
The
Talking about the
facade.
facade.
They
It's
took and went
unbelievable.
up, covered almost the whole front of the building,
I think I remember that.
totally, with glass, with different symbols. Like...
It was 50s, 1950s.
Was it the- it was
style.
Oh, yes. I remember now what you're talking about.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Geometric patterns like
Yeah.
Right. And they said, isn't that horrible? Look what Carlson did on the corner. He covered up a beautiful 18th century building. And now the Augusts have covered up another beautiful building with this thing. So the next guy who bought it was also Jewish, and a customer, I've forgotten his name.
What, Carlson's name?
No, the one who bought Ann August.
Oh, Jeffrey Lipson.
Yeah, Jeffrey Lipson.
But he wasn't from Northampton.
No, he wasn't from Northampton, but he bought it when the Augusts were going out. They could show him, look what an incredible family store we have. Reason we're not going on is, look, it's still going great, but our kids are medical school and this and that, and we
So
have
you
nobody.
Yeah.
We've got to sell out. We want to get out. We're getting old. In the meantime, I don't think he recognized that King Street was going to have an impact, and that all these women's clothing and all this was going to go down the tubes.
Mm-hmm.
He bought into it, and of course he couldn't really do much with it, and so that went down the tubes.
Within a few years was gone.
Yes, yeah, maybe he was here, maybe 10 years.
Yeah.
He
He
was
was there a
there.
while.
He was there.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah,
I mean, he
oh, yeah.
struggled because I talked to him. He used to come in and tell me we had the only decent store on Main Street.
Did he keep the name Ann August?
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it did. Yeah, we went in there once. Yeah.
And then they had Ann August because his Al August recognized his in-laws, his brother-in-laws, would be coming back, and he needed to provide jobs for them. Thought ahead of time and decided he had to make a store called Ann August Youth Shop, and that's where my father was actually.
Diagonally across the street from Ann August, there was Ann.
No, it's
August.
actually it's more across from
It was up a little higher
Up-
across the street.
almost from City Hall.
It was an Ann August youth shop.
Yeah, it was the Ann August Youth
It
Shop.
was across the street.
And that's where one of my father's stores were. And the man who owned it was Pat Montague, who later, who wanted the money because he's the one that started WHMP.
Yeah, you said that before, right?
And he told my father, he says, buy the store, buy this building because you're going to be sorry. And my mother was so opposed to it that he didn't buy it. Al August bought it, turned it into Ann August Youth Shop. And so my father only had one choice. He'd move up. Lipshire's bought that store further up. So he had to move up there. So that was that.
And the August family also had a store in Greenfield.
Yeah,
I know.
and in,
Oh, yeah.
in Amherst too.
Oh, yeah.
I'm gonna sound like a real. I took out.
Never mind.
He had a brother who started the store in Greenfield,
Yeah.
and they came in and said, "You ought to take out my niece named Ann August, who's up in Greenfield." So I trotted up to to Greenfield. No, well, that was up there, but they
You went
had
up to the woods up in Greenfield?
well, yeah, that's what they called it, the woods. But it was they had it's a big main street, and the one thing they lack is Smith College.
Where on Main Street was Aunt August? Do you remember?
I don't remember.
What's the name of the department store? Wilson.
Wilson.
No, Wilson's was always there.
It was always there.
Oh yes, Wilson's is an old timer.
So
Wilson.
and so the way Greenfield looks now, is that sort of the way Northampton looked in 1950?
Yes, and that's the way they want to keep it.
Right.
They don't want any of this stuff. They don't want a King Street. They don't want any of these things. And they actually hired somebody who came in and more or less guaranteed this is how we're going to keep out these Walmarts. And so Walmart goes to the next town over and says, oh, look, Greenfield won't do it. You can't be as dumb as they are. And I guess they went over. I'm not sure what happened. I think they did. But Greenfield blocked them.
Good. Next shop.
Well, so I told you about going off of Main Street. There was Masonic Street. And we had a tailoring shop. Again, I'm telling you, one of these people who learned to do things with their hands. His name was Tolchinsky.
Tolchinsky.
I think some of them changed their name to Toll, T-O-L-L. That went out when they built the parking lot.
Next to the police station?
The parking lot on Masonic Street.
Oh, on Masonic Street.
Masonic Street is a parking
Christian
lot.
Science.
Well, it's in back of Masonic Street runs from Main Street to Center Street.
Right.
And if you go down Masonic Street,
Oh, the public parking lot.
that's a public parking
Okay,
lot.
got it.
And that had 3 or 4, the man who owned it was a man named LeBeau, who was my father's friend. And so we wanted the wood that was in that thing, and that was made like 200 years ago. And you couldn't knock it, was wood, and we thought we could knock it down because we wanted to build a summer camp in Goshen. And the thing was put together with pegs. They didn't even use nails. What they used to do is drill a hole and put doweling in and wet it and let it dry. And then they'd notch the thing to begin with. So it was notched, and then a doweling peg was put through the thing. And you couldn't get the thing. We had to really work to get it down.
You got the wood?
Yeah, we got the wood.
So what 3 stores were in that parking lot?
So I mean, there was
Yeah.
the one of them that had to do with somebody who was Jewish was Tolchinsky, who had a tailor shop, and another thing that was there was a cobbler shop. Some little tiny stores. I don't think they were more than 300 square feet. But how much you need for a cobbler needs his place to cobble, and he needs a place to store his shoes. And that's it, and the tailor didn't need much more. And so they were little stores, and they took that whole thing out, and in the back there was a thing called a Cracker Barrel. It's where they originally, I think, had made crackers or something in the old days. They knocked down everything.
Cracker Barrel Alley.
Yeah, and they made a parking lot there. So that took care of that. Then there was College Corner. College Corner was on the corner of Green Street and West Street, directly across from the library. There's a thing that looks like it had maybe a fountain and a place to have lunch, and sold a bunch of things like that. Well, that was College Corner, and that was owned by Norman Allen and A.B. Allen and Charlotte and Ethel and a bunch of Allens, Sadie Allen, that somehow had a finger in it. But the one I remember working there was Norman Allen, and that was College Corner. That was Jewish operated.
What was it?
It was, it was
Luncheonette?
like a luncheonette.
Oh, I see.
You could buy things that girls might need, like aspirin, and maybe they had Kleenex, and they had, quick items that they could stock, and a jobber could come in and they could fill it up. And the girls could go there, and it was exactly...
Like a convenience store.
Yeah, it was exactly across the street from Hubbard and Washburn up there at the corner. And it was on Green Street, and the girls used to go down. There was John Everett's, Peck and Peck, Wilmot, a bunch of clothing stores, and things that girls could get at lunch. Bicycle repair shop by Gerard's. and things like that, you know. And then a bookstore, a Hampshire bookstore, eventually went in there. But when we were kids living there, it was mostly old houses. And as things progressed, people would say, hey, those girls need something. And some guy would put in a bookstore, and another guy put in something
Into
else.
the old houses?
In front of them. You know, like what used to be a living room or a reception room and a front lawn, suddenly you don't need the front lawn anymore, right? So you put in a door and a window. You don't need the front porch anymore, right? Now you got a whole store, and the building's still upstairs. So now you got an income from here, and that's what they did. All.
Are you suggesting that most of the people on that street were Jews?
No, I'm not.
Just one.
Just one.
Just
Just giving
one.
us some other names now. Yeah.
No, I just gave you other names.
Exactly.
So the buildings that are there now are the same buildings? If I go back and look at the structure of these buildings,
If you went back last year,
They've knocked them down now.
They've knocked them down for this.
they haven't knocked all of them down.
Yes, they most
On
of them.
Green?
Yeah,
No, Green still has,
very
the
few.
beginning of Green is still good.
Well, yeah, the very top they have can't go down for 6 years or whatever.
Yeah.
But
The
they
restaurant
started.
is still there.
They started on the Belmont Avenue side,
Right.
and they worked its way up.
Right.
What's going in there is like a $50 million girls' engineering building.
Right.
And that's where I mentioned we lived on Belmont Avenue. Our house was down that way where they're taking the stuff. So I only mentioned the College Corner, which was owned by the Allens, and the one I mostly saw in there was Norman Allen, and he was a brother to A.B. Allen, who I mentioned was the real estate man who seemed to do a whole bunch of business walking up down Main Street. And he had the singular of probably being the oldest person drafted in World War II. He was 39 years old, but he wasn't married. And he just met the criterion of being 39, not married, and they needed warm bodies, and off he went. So that was A.B. Allen.
And survived.
He survived, and he came back, and he got married, and he had a daughter, I think, who went to UMass. Then who was there? Oh, Maple Street, I think I mentioned Jack August, who Jack August had the big fish store. Was big. In fact, Jack August, the only thing bigger than Jack August's business was his ego. Because he made a deal with Snow's, and they canned the clam chowder and put his name on it, Jack August. And so I know Howard, his son, was through ROTC, was in the service in the Korean War. And so what's he do? I don't think any other father did this. Gets in a plane, takes off with a case of his Jack August clam chowder, gets to the base, tells Howard's base commander he's Jack August, he's here from Jack August, so-and-so, sends it to the colonel with his compliments, and gets to see his son in the Korean War. And nobody else had his chutzpah to go and do this. He didn't say, I got this damn little restaurant, it's on the corner of Holly Street and Main Street. And just a couple of years ago I was selling fish at the counter. Now I got a restaurant in Snow's, Kansas, but I would have thought he was Howard Johnson, you know.
I see in your notes that Maple Street is now called Conn Street.
Yeah.
So this is Conn Street we're talking about.
Yeah, well, when we get down to the fact that there was a grocery store down there owned by Harry August, who was a brother of Jack August.
Where was this?
It was, you know where Maplewood stores are now?
Yeah.
Maplewood shops.
Maplewood shops. On the corner there's a street, and he had this. Actually, Harry married somebody whose father actually had a little walk-in grocery store, and he married it. He married the daughter, and somehow they enlarged that grocery store, and he had a grocery store in there, but it was a kind of a grocery store where his wife would stay there and man the grocery store because it was part of the house, actually, and he would go around he would go around and take orders. For example, my mother was a customer, and he'd hear her knocking on the door, and it would be Harry. And Harry, the trash barrel was out there. Harry would look in, there's an empty salada tea thing. Elizabeth, you need salada tea, or whatever. But that was his business, and then he would deliver it.
Wait, we just did this guy. Is that where the Dairy Mart is we're talking about in that corner? Or across the street?
No,
It's in Maplewood, huh?
It's in Maplewood.
Shops?
It's across the street from one of these stores that they call it. It has everything. You go in.
Convenience store.
Yeah, a convenience store. There's
Yeah,
a
that's
big
what I'm
one.
talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that
okay.
one. It's,
Okay.
I don't know what they call it now. But that's where it was. And there was another little one just as crazy and just as small called Wright's, or it was one of these old Yankee stores. There used to be a lot of things called Red and White, and all kinds of New England stores that preceded the First National and the A&P. They were little chain stores that grocers would buy in combination, and a truck would come up and say it's a Red and White store. And actually, all of them put together, that wouldn't do as much as any one of these stop and shops would do, I mean, they just had a mom and pop store, and they had butter and eggs and cheese and milk and so forth. And people who many of them didn't have cars, then they could walk to the store and get their stuff. In this little store down here on Franklin Street called Pushkin's, there was the same thing until maybe only 30 years ago. These little mom and pop stores till mom and pop die off, and that's the end of it. And then at this time, before there was a Pepsi-Cola and a Coca-Cola, Pepsi handed out their franchises. So in Northampton, there was the bottling company in Florence, it was called just Bottling Company, and it was owned by Harry Ziff and Milton Tashes. And his daughter, Ziff's daughter, was Eleanor, that I mentioned, was the prettiest girl in Northampton, my class. So they actually had the concession for bottling Pepsi-Cola. Until Pepsi got so big that they took it away from these local people, they'd send him the syrup, and he supplied the water and fizz and put it in bottles and distribute it. And that's the way they did things in those days. And the other one was down on Hamden Street. You know where Hamden Street is? It runs from Pleasant Street. It's in back of the parking lot. You know where Pleasant
Yes.
Street is?
Hampton Avenue.
The Hampton Court is
Right.
built there now.
Yeah,
Avenue.
right. And there's a apartment house and all that kind of stuff.
WHMP.
Okay, so now there's a garage, and there's a place that serves food. But before all this stuff, there was a thing called a bottling company, Boynton's Bottling Company, that was owned by Ziff, who I think is a cousin of Harry Ziff, but not anything to do with it. And a guy named Michelson or Michaelman Oxwell got involved in it. But they also made this, when in those days, all you really need was flavoring, fizzy water, in a bottle, and sell it. And that's, that was business. And that's
There
because
was a guy named Tarsus.
Tashes, yeah.
Spell it.
Tarshus.
And what happened to him?
Milton Tashes was married to Bernice Tashes. The two of them were partners in this Pepsi-Cola place I mentioned. The two wives, Esther Ziff and Bernice Tashes, hated each other's guts from day one, and they couldn't get along. And finally, Milton Tashes bought out Harry Ziff, and Harry Ziff opened Ziff's Package Store, which opened up on Lower Main Street, right next to where I indicated the drugstore had been. Just before they come to Pleasant Street, there was a little tiny store, and you had to actually pay off to get a liquor license in those days. But Harry Ziff was in World War I, and one of his best buddies was in the state legislature. Northampton at that time, the state decided to change the way they figured the population. They decided to include people who were here for more than 8 months out of a year. That particular year, they included the VA the State Hospital, and Smith College, and suddenly Northampton increased the population. They got permission to have one more license, and Milton and Harry knew, and they worked it out. I think he had to pay through the nose to get it, but he finally got it. That's when every package store in this city was on Main Street or Pleasant Street. And so the only ones that had liquor were the drugstores, like I had a liquor license, and the package stores. There was no thing on King Street, no nothing. You had to go into a small store and get liquor. That's how you did it.
You had a liquor license?
Yeah.
And you sold liquor? With the cosmetics or later?
No, always.
Always sold liquor? We're talking about scotch, rye, what are we talking?
Yeah, we're talking Seagram 7.
That must have been a good business too, no?
Yeah, well, you were guaranteed because the state had a price. If you sold below it, you got into trouble. I mean, if the state set the price of $4.95 and they found you selling it for $4.79, oh boy, were you in trouble. So you were guaranteed a 20% markup, no matter what happened. Good kind who would buy, I mean, not good kind, but I mean, upstanding citizens.
They'd have to have a bottle of scotch
who would, you know, and sometimes the drugstore was of advantage to them because they might say, Norm, look, I didn't expect these people coming in on Sunday and I haven't got a thing in the store. Like, what can you do for me? I need this and this.
And Sunday you're not supposed to sell liquor?
Not in Massachusetts.
Right, so you were able to kind of get them a bottle?
Yeah, I mean, if a guy came in who didn't know,
you wouldn't do it?
I mean, if you knew someone, he's your friend, he comes in, he lives next door. He says, what can I do? They dropped in on me and I haven't got a drop. Always drugstores had the right in Massachusetts because there's a thing called the United States Pharmacopoeia, USP. Every drug that's standard in this country must come through the USP. And what's listed in there is whiskey and alcohol and rye and wine and all these things because pharmacists in a large part were responsible for these things in the colonies. When during the Revolution, when they realized that the one thing they could make money on was taxing the whiskey, you must know the Whiskey Rebellion here in Massachusetts, they started putting taxes on liquor. And that from that point on, it became increasingly difficult for pharmacists to make the stuff. But we always had to have alcohol for compounding. In fact, it became so difficult for us to make the alcohol because of the federal regulations. You pay a $100 tax to do it. Then you pay a $100 tax to inspect the place. Then you pay a $100 tax to renew it. And it's easier to just go down and buy bottled 85% USP alcohol and sell it. And so I used to just buy it sealed and didn't file papers with anybody in case they wanted to use alcohol in compounding a prescription, which you do. You use alcohol sometimes for some prescriptions. Okay. So then there were people who, so I mentioned the bottling companies.
Right.
We got through with them. We got into the story about the Tashists and the two wives couldn't get together.
Got it.
So Harry took his money. He went out. He bought the package store. Package stores later went down the tubes. The bottling company later went down the tubes because Pepsi did Pepsi. Mm-hmm. They didn't need him. All right, so we're off of Main Street. We talked about Bernice Greenberg, who's still around town. She was Bernice Clodney. She was my classmate. She's married to Stanley Greenberg.
Oh.
He was around town at the time. He was one of the people, I think his father was originally moved from New York to some factory that was in East Hampton, but they lived in Northampton. Stanley has two brothers. One is David and one is Sheldon, and Stanley was the oldest. Stanley is about 3 years older than I am. I'm in the class of 45, he's in the class of 42. He went in the service 3 years before I had to. Right now he's in not too good shape. You know, he has a cane and he walks around, and Bernice is my age. She's still hanging on like I am. And they were living on Butler Place where we were, that I mentioned, in the father's house. And the father wasn't the best one to live with or work with. one day Stanley went out and bought 100 acres of land out in West Hampton and said to Bernice, we're moving out there, and that's where they've been ever since. So, then there's the August group that you mentioned. As I remember, I told Ken that I had called Rita Fogel, who was Rita August, who lived around the corner from me. When we lived on Belmont Avenue, she lived on Awaga Place. She lived in the same house that now, do you know?
High or Minimus?
Yeah, no,
High
Edelstein.
High Edelstein lives there now. Before I bought it from them, and Rita and I were neighbors. She had a sister, Rita, a brother, Howard, and a sister, Judy. Rita is the one I spoke to about 3 weeks. I said to after I spoke to her, and she collaborated with me.
She helped.
She died.
No.
So there's another group of August that I asked her help on, and that was the August group that was down with the cattle dealers.
The cattle dealers.
Down on Con Street. And that was SB, that was Sam August, and NH August. Now they have three kids. Billy August went to, I guess, Cornell and Brandeis. Priscilla went off to college someplace. They're not going in the cattle business. They're out. NH August has a kid. Their kid is, I've forgotten his name, but he's around town. He opened up an insurance, a real estate business up on what the hell's the name of it? Jesus. Anyway, it was right here in town, and he sold out, but he really works at the university. I've forgotten what he does. Bob August. Do you know Bob August?
Oh,
That's Dutchy August's son.
Who's the one who has the tree farm?
yeah. That's Bob August.
It might be Bob August. Okay.
he's
he
not-
was,
Wakely.
yeah, I guess I lost track of Bob.
He's
Bob
not
used to
well.
Well, his wife isn't too well either. She put on a lot of weight or something. Wasn't it Bob August that was married to Dutchy? That's Dutchy August's son. Yeah, and they were in the cattle business.
The August. Right?
Yes, August.
Bob August, who has a farm,
Who
is
sold that
Dutchy's son?
I didn't know that. That's
Yeah.
Dutchy's son?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Well,
He's
he
sick.
looks like her age.
Yeah.
Well, he's younger than I am. If that helps him out at all.
No, Bob, the guy we know in Wakely,
Yeah.
he's our age. About 65, no?
Yeah.
He could be.
Dutchy's 90.
Oh.
And Dutchy's
doesn't
the one
look
that's
it,
with
but
her.
she's
She's
nice.
Myra Gould, the one.
She's
Yeah.
with Mara School, yeah.
Yeah, and Morris Gould's daughter, he had the furniture store that I alluded to, the big furniture. First he was on the corner of Market Street and Main Street, which is a little tiny store. And the next thing I knew, you know, the girl he married was related to the people in Athol and Orange who were big furniture people. And she was really the one.
Plotkin.
Plotkins, yeah. And she was the one really was behind the thing. When Morris was actually a man who went around and represented Fishman. Fishman was like a little 5 and 10 cent store in Vermont. And Morris would go around and set up their window displays and so forth. Then he saw this Plotkin girl from Athol and so forth. He married her. They moved to Northampton. They opened that little store on the corner that I mentioned
Which corner?
of Market Street.
Yeah, but which corner?
Well,
The
Jack
one closer
August.
to the
no, Jack
synagogue?
August. Jack August. No, the one that's on the other side of the synagogue.
Closer to the
Right.
railroad track.
Right.
Uh-huh.
That
It's a
corner.
little dress shop now.
Right. All right. It was a little furniture store. When then he leased this place that was on King Street. That was quite large, and suddenly he got into the big furniture business, where they had trucks and things like that to deliver furniture. And suddenly Morris Gould became quite a big shot from that little store. And
Got to be a big store.
it was largely based on Plotkin was really she was really the motivating thing behind it.
She worked with him in the store.
She was always there.
She was part of it. They were true partners.
you know.
It was a true collaboration, and they were very successful.
And they
They were good.
yeah,
They
and
were
they
very good business people.
they married her daughter. They had one daughter who went off to college, and she was going to come back for a furniture business. And she married the librarian's son.
Who's she?
What's her name?
The granddaughter?
The daughter, Morris Gould's daughter.
They had one
And
daughter.
I've forgotten what her
Susan.
name is. Susan Gould.
She married somebody from Tufts.
Married, his name was Wickander.
Oh, no,
Yeah. No, that was...
No, you have it totally mixed up.
No, she married a banker.
The Wall
She
Street
married-
guy, you said.
Yes.
He was a
married-
professor who you said went to Wall
No,
No,
that's
that's
Evelyn
different.
Lipshire's.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
That's the shoe store.
Susan Gould married someone she went to Tufts with, and he is in finance or something.
Okay.
And she has two daughters. I don't know. She married someone who's not Jewish. I don't know how they
Yeah.
was Jews or not. I don't know.
Yeah.
What you're thinking of is
Allen's sister, Sadie Allen.
yeah.
Sadie Allen was Abe Allen's sister. Remember I said there were a bunch of Allens, and I mentioned Norman Allen, Abe Allen, Sadie Allen, so forth, Gussie Allen. All right, well, Sadie Allen was really headed to be a spinster. She was quite, I'll say she was in her 30s, late 30s.
That's spinster material.
Right.
On those days.
And she wasn't awfully attractive, but she did have a nice personality. And there was this refugee, World War II Holocaust victim, who somehow ended up in our area,
Yeah.
and she married him. And they had a daughter. And that daughter, what was that daughter's name? Anyway, she married the librarian's son. And he
was very prominent.
Very prominent.
Wickander,
Wickander. He later he was one to do all the talks at all the chamber meetings. He had no, but he had all the personality that anyone could have. Larry Wickander.
What was her maiden name, this woman? Her father's name? Who was the refugee?
Wasn't it Alan?
No.
The mother was an Allen.
The mother
Sadie Allen. I've forgotten what her name. They were
think of it.
Okay.
there was prescription customers. I should know because
This
She-
guy remembers all these
Sure.
people.
she doted over this little girl. Like I'm telling you, if she sneezed, she'd be on the phone. I don't know what I'm going to do, Susan. And
What would you prescribe for a sneeze?
Kleenex.
Is enough. And she watched over her and everything. And then the Holocaust victim, I know we were in the movie one time, Charlotte and I, and we saw him necking in the movie. You know,
the daughter.
the daughter.
Yeah.
She saw her, she turned, you could see in the movie she turned red all over. Anyway, she married this Wickander's son, and he became a physician, I think, in Chelmsford.
Are these Jews?
Well,
The-
she's Jewish,
she's
but
Jewish.
Wickander is
Wickander.
not.
No. So part of this whole story is these are all Jews who live in a small community, who go up and go to college, who aren't going to Main Street, who usually marry non-Jews and move away. That's the story. And in their place come a bunch of Jews who are from New York and move in and take their place. That's the whole story here. That's all I have to say about everything.
Now tell
Okay.
us about your children in terms of...
Wait a minute, there's a little bit I found. You know about twin cleaners.
I was going to ask you about the Raymonds. You didn't mention
Yes,
that.
no, the Raymonds, well, because they're not on Main Street, they're on North Street.
They were on Main Street.
No.
No.
North Street.
Oh, that's
Oh,
North
the
Street.
Raymond Insurance was.
Yeah.
Raymond Insurance.
That's
Yeah,
later.
yeah, but that's just
the son.
That's
He's
But
going
the
way
father
back.
had insurance.
Well,
And the
he did.
grandfather.
He had a
Adolf.
cleaning
Adolf.
business.
Tell us about them.
Adolf Raymond was the one who came in, was a refugee. I mean, not a refugee, but from Europe, without any real education, but with more business sense than these people who are graduating from Harvard Business School. He saw a piece of property, he says, I'll take it. And there's a business, I'll do it. And so he established Twin Cleaners. And Twin Cleaners was the preeminent thing. Before people did their own cleaning or whatever, before there were these modernizing 1-hour cleaning things, if you wanted cleaning done in Northampton in the 30s to the 40s to the 50s, you had to go to Twin Cleaners. They stored your furs. They did all that stuff. And anyway, he bought up real estate till he had real estate on Crafts Avenue and real estate on King Street and real estate on North King Street. And he had he managed to have these two boys who were what was their name? Jim Raymond, who had the insurance, and Sherwin Raymond, who was the physician, who went up to McGill. McGill is a Canadian medical school who do not take Jews. However, he graduated medical school, married a girl named Henshey, is not Jewish, then to him. I mean, he's still around, but that's the story.
No connection.
Then there's Jim Raymond, who married, you must know Judy Raymond.
I knew Judy Raymond.
Right, who had the insurance.
And the real estate.
And the real estate. Jimmy Raymond had two girls that were twins. One of them was killed down on Bridge Street. And the boys, I think, is running his insurance business. And he kicked out that Goodwill store that was on Main Street.
And put a tattoo store in. And now has Zen restaurant.
Yeah. Okay. So that's Raymond, who was the one thing that I didn't mention.
Excuse me, is the name of the grandfather's store Twins because of his granddaughters were twins?
Right, because his granddaughters, two of them were twins. One of them was killed on Bridge Street.
That's why it was called Twin.
Well, not
Twin
no. They were
Cleaners?
First it was Twin Cleaner,
Oh.
and then subsequently, at some time after that.
Oh, well, I was asking the other way around, how they got the name
Twin Cleaner
Twins.
goes back to like the 30s or
Right,
40s.
Twin Cleaner goes back further. First, when the girls were first born or whatever, it was called Twin Cleaners. And Adolf named it, and it was the preeminent.
Yeah, I understood that.
Okay.
So it's a coincidence that they happen to have twins.
Either it's a coincidence, I guess it's a coincidence.
Do you know why they called it Twin
I
Cleaners?
haven't the slightest idea.
Can you tell us?
I just assumed that the chicken came before the egg, and that the twins were here first, and then he named it Twins.
But it's not.
I don't know what it was called before.
Remember Adolf, what he was like as a personality?
No, except I heard he was a very sharp businessman.
Was he involved in the synagogue at all?
Oh, I think so.
I think
You don't
His
remember?
wife, Minnie, was it Minnie?
I think so.
She was very active when I first came to Northampton in 1963. She was very much involved, and she used to run the rummage sales for the show.
Where did Judy Raymond come from?
She married Jimmy.
Yeah, but where'd she come from?
She went to Smith College, and somehow he went to Amherst College. He was in World War II. He was a pilot. And somehow, I don't know, I met her in a summer resort. I don't know where he met her, but she ended up here. And she was the driving force of the real estate.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, she was a real estate person. Well, I think I got into the fact that we were talking about anti-Semitism, and I mentioned the house that we had the difficulty with, the few things that happened with the Zedek business with the Polish kids. Walter Howell went upstairs. There was no anti-Semitism. I was the head of the Legion when I came back.
American Legion?
Yeah, because most of these guys were World War I. They never saw a captain before, kind of. So I got talked into it because we had a liquor license and we were across the street from the Legion Hall. So Meyer Ziff also sold liquor, one of the Ziff boys. He sold liquor independently of Harry. He worked for a company called Federal Supply in Boston, and they sold liquor, and that was one of my distributors, and that was it. I told you about the Lions Club not taking really Jews.
And the Kiwanis Club took a lot of Jews.
Yes, there were at least 20% of the Kiwanis and Rotary were Jews. There was one thing, I had an incident, one thing in Northampton High School, and that was a teacher. Her name was Nora Clifford. I didn't have her, she taught typing. And I hated her from the day I saw her, and she hated me. Unfortunately, I had her for a home room. And it came, I think, on Kippur or Rosh Hashanah. And I was out. And she had to say, "Winston, where's your note?" She knew goddamn well why I was out. So I said, well, it was a Jewish holiday. I need a note. So finally I really annoyed why I even had to produce a note. Anyway, I gave her a note, and the note was signed by my mother. However, my mother and I, she's the one that taught me how to write. My mother had a very straight writing, which anybody could imitate. And I could imitate it from the day from when I was 5. They'd say, Mom, how do you write Elizabeth without? And she would say, oh, I put a little thing on, and then I would have it down perfect. Anyway, why I think it was hers, and if it wasn't, if they checked with my mother, she certainly would have, because she had a fight with me to stay home if I was sick, because it's too damn difficult to make up what you missed. So anyway, she says, I won't accept that, that's a forgery, you stay after school. So I said, I won't stay after school. I will not stay after school. And she says, Winston, I told you, sit in that chair. And I really went over the top. I just couldn't take it anymore. I said, I will not, and there's not a goddamn thing you can do about it. And the class was watching, and she says, well, see about that. And so I raced down to the office. She was racing down there with me. And we got down to the office, and we ran into John Foran, who was the assistant principal. And I said, I'm not staying after school, and this is a note, and if you don't believe me, you can check it with my mother. Call her up now. Well, they didn't call her, and they didn't check it, and I don't remember staying after school, but they must have resolved it somehow between them, because I did not stay, and I wasn't, because I was really annoyed about that. Well, that's all I can think about.
In this mind, that reflects the anti-Semitism, of course, on the part of the teacher.
Well, I think most of it, the other teachers all got along fine. If I had said anything to my Latin teacher or my English teacher, she, okay, bring it in tomorrow, or whatever, if she really needed it. But she didn't. She said, that's a forgery.
All right, got it. When you think of your friendships in elementary school, junior high school, and high school, were you friendly with lots of different kids from different backgrounds?
Yeah.
You had lots of good friends who weren't Jewish.
Right. But I had no Jewish friends, really.
So that wasn't an issue at all.
No, it wasn't really.
Right, but I'm saying you had lots of.
There were no Jews. In fact, there was one thing I thought of that was funny. It showed you this picture of I was an Eagle Scout.
Oh, tell us about the Eagle Scout.
Oh, okay. So anyway, Jewish kids, if there were any around here, went to what, Camp Rama or some place like that. And I was determined.
This is the better one. Right?
I took it off of there was a newspaper photo which I Xeroxed downstairs.
Oh, that's good.
So so anyway, there were 2 things I determined very early. I didn't know how to swim, but I wanted to get into the Navy and get into the war, and I was too young. The agreement was I stay and I graduate high school, get accepted to college, and before I'm 18, they'll sign my papers, I go in the Navy. Learn to get in the Navy, I have to know how to swim. I had an absolute fear of swimming. It must have taken me 3 years of intensive training at the YMCA and Boy Scouts before I'd even put my head in the water, swim underwater, do the diving, and everything you had to do for Eagle Scout, for life-saving, and so forth. So finally I accomplished that thing. And one on the way there, I was a counselor in the scout camp. There's like 120 boys in Camp Chesterfield, not another Jewish kid. One day a kid comes up to me, and his name is Warshawski. He says to me, they said you were Jewish. They said you were Jewish, is that true? And I says, yeah. Oh, I'm glad. And he ran off. So then somebody, I figure, must have been talking someplace, and this kid felt he was the only Jewish kid until he learned there was a scout counselor who was. So somehow the kids I never even dreamed anyone thought I was Jewish or knew I was Jewish or anything. But somehow he heard it and came to check it out with me.
Got it. All right. Thank you. I'd like to ask Charlotte to talk a little bit about how she came to Northampton. But first, can you tell us a little bit about your family, how they got to New Bedford, where your family's from, your maiden name, your family names, where they came from.
Okay, I'll try to briefly explain. I was Charlotte Rosenthal, brought up in New Bedford. My mother was Ruth Gorse, was a very large Gorse family from Fall River, which was like a neighboring, I think they were like 14 miles apart, but they were very close, New Bedford and Fall River. The Gorse family were a big Jewish family in Fall River, Gourse. It's a fairly rare name. I don't know what it was originally. I understand that my grandfather, Gorse, came from Russia, that he had been a physician in Russia, came to this country and was a peddler, needles, and went around peddling soft goods, I don't know, dry goods or whatever. And eventually he and his sons, I think there were 5 boys, they opened a clothing store in Fall River, Mass., and it was a very large, successful clothing store, the Hub clothing store. I didn't know my grandfather, I was named for him. But I certainly knew my uncles, his sons. And several of them stayed in Fall River with the Hub. And 2 of them went to New York City, and there was a Hub clothing store. It was called Gorsat clothing store in New York, down in the Wall Street area, that I believe did very well. And they clothed the attorneys and brokers and sold suits to people who
War suits?
Business.
Mm-hmm.
And then about 10 or 15 years ago, somebody sent me an article. First of all, they sold out their business to someone else. And then around 10 or 15 years ago, somebody sent me somebody in the family that business is now gone. There's no more Gorsat in New York City, and there's no more Hub in Fall River. I think the city took it for a highway. My father's family, of course they came from the old country originally. I think they came to Boston, and then to New Bedford. I don't think my father was born in New Bedford. I think he was born in Boston. And they were very, very poor. They were very poor. My grandfather was very highly educated and a brilliant man and tremendous intellectual curiosity, but he really wasn't skilled at making a living very well. So they were very poor. And my father's sister, who's my aunt, lived in Hartford, and I really didn't know her very well until maybe the 70s or 80s. I didn't know her when I was in New Bedford, and then when I first was married and busy with children, I didn't. And she had her life. But when she got old and she needed help, she called me because she was in Hartford, and I got to know her, and I got a lot of stories how terribly poor people were then. That when she was 6 years old, her mother would send her several miles to buy cracked eggs, for example. And it seems like all the Jewish families around were in the same boat, but they all helped each other. If there was somebody was sick, her mother would put together a basket of food and send it over. As poor as they were, they helped each other. My father. There was a factory sort of diagonally across from where they lived, the Morse Twist Drill. And I'm a little fuzzy about the details. I know he worked there. I believe he was about 14. So he must have had to drop out of high school to help support the family. And I know that he used to talk and say that he used to tell the other workers that someday he'd make something of himself, that he was going to make something of himself. Mm-hmm. And the other workers said, no, you'll end up here all your life the way we are. So I don't know how he got a high school education. I know he could recite pages of Shakespeare, especially that from the Merchant of Venice. He could, he was very brilliant. He played the violin. And so he had to have gotten a high school diploma, and then he won. He thought of being a musician. He played the violin beautifully, but they thought he would never make a living that way. And then he wanted to be a surgeon, but that was a longer course than going to dental school. So he went to dental school, the first dental school in the country, the old Baltimore College of Dentistry, which became part of the University of Maryland. And there was no money, no support from home, and he supported himself, I guess, giving violin lessons. And there were pictures from that time, some pictures even when he graduated, and he was gaunt. They didn't have enough to eat. But he managed to get through, and he became a dentist. And he talks about, he used to say how he would look in the window of the bakery and see the cream puffs that were 5 cents. Of course, he didn't have 5 cents. And so even, later in life, if he'd see, my mother would get cream puffs, would buy something like that, it was just, you could see it was an emotional experience for him almost. He got out of school about the time of the flu epidemic. He had they set up a dental practice, but he didn't have any patients, of course, in the beginning. But he went around with a physician in town helping out with the flu epidemic. I guess he didn't get it, I don't know. And I understand it was a year before he had his first patient. But he did become a very successful dentist with a well-established practice. And he was, considered a very good dentist in those times. They didn't have the modern equipment that we have nowadays. And I have 2 brothers, 2 older brothers, and the older one also became a dentist and practiced with my father until my father died. He died when he had just turned 69. He was pretty young, but in those days that wasn't so young.
This is all in New Bedford.
All in New Bedford.
So he stayed in the town he came from,
and
the child went back to work with the father.
Yes, my older went back. Yes, but my second brother became a physician, and he's a dermatologist, and he moved to Trenton, New Jersey, because he married a girl from that area, and that's where he settled. So he lives in Princeton now.
And what did you pursue?
Business. I didn't have a profession. I went to Tufts like my brothers had, and then once I married in 1963, came to Northampton.
When did you graduate from school, from college?
In 1953.
And what did you do from 53 to 63?
I lived in New York for 6 years and worked, in a few different jobs in New York. And the most interesting one was the first one for it was called America's Town Meeting of the Year. And it was a radio program, but there was participation with the public. And there was tremendous correspondence going on that I really was in charge of. I was never on the air. There were only 2 of us, the lady who was on the air and me. But it was a very well-established program at that time. That was a very enjoyable thing. And
you did 6 years in New York.
I did 6 years.
Where did you live in New York in those days?
I lived in Manhattan. I lived in the beginning of the 92nd Street Y, which was absolutely marvelous. It was
Jewish girl would go there to start out in New York.
Yeah. And Jewish, there were floors for girls and floors for boys.
What year are we talking?
54?
In the middle 50s, yeah. And then after, I stayed as long as you could, which was 3 years. And then you had to get out. And another girl who was there and I got an apartment on East 78th Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenue. And one day in our business, on a Sunday, I was there helping, Norman and Northampton, Brantwood Farm,
Oh, so you're up
And
here
somebody, I'm jumping ahead because somebody came in and I recognized the address as the same building that I had lived on East 78th Street. Talk about coincidence.
So how did you come from New York back up here?
Oh, I went to Boston. I left New York. My family urged a lot of pressure from the family to leave New York at that point. And I moved to Boston, and there were a lot of family ties there. And I lived in Brookline, near Coolidge Corner.
Uh-huh.
And
what did you do there?
I worked for a
Well, I don't.
Well, I was going to say that it was an educational, a place that was very innovative with educational textbooks and films. And
Do you remember the name?
I think it was called Educational Services, but it's not in existence. It was in Watertown. It was very stimulating. It was really, really, really wonderful. They got started in science education. It was after Sputnik went up, and it was great emphasis on.
So is it
catching
1960 now?
Yeah, 1960. That's right. And I met Norman.
How did you meet Norman?
Well, it was a weekend at a summer resort in Connecticut.
Oh, what's it called? The resort?
The Griswold.
Yeah.
But it
Was it a
broke
place
down.
where Jewish folks went, or just anybody
Yes,
went?
no, it was a Jewish resort.
Once in a while, someone who wasn't Jewish would end up there.
It was a Jewish resort.
What
and
town was it in?
Groton, Connecticut.
Okay.
And I had a car in Boston. And I had a very good friend who did not have a car. She had a sister too. And they wanted to go to this place. So I drove them. I took them. The three of us went. And it turned out that they had a tie to Northampton. Especially the sister that I wasn't friendly with, the older one, had somehow knew the Bonds or something.
Sister-in-law.
Oh, they had another sister who was married to one of the Bond brothers. So they had met that older girl had met Norman. And Norman was there, and this older, the sister that I wasn't that friendly with, somehow she saw Norman in the room and instantly said, "This is for you," and she dragged me over.
Really?
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing.
It was just instantly. She was a very eccentric girl, but
She was intuitive.
She
must
was
have been-
intuitive. Yeah,
She
said,
knew something?
Charlotte, this is for you. Dragged me over. I was very embarrassed because in those days, girls
yeah,
weren't so
right.
forward. So.
Yeah.
But that's how
That's
we
how you met.
Yeah, that's the way we met. But I guess we've had stories about anti-Semitism, and I guess I should talk about it because people won't realize what it was like. And growing up in New Bedford, we lived in a nice area, but nevertheless, once in a while, there would be kids who would chase after me saying, "Dirty Jew, dirty Jew." And I was very young then, maybe 5 or 6, and I just remember feeling terrible, just coming in sobbing into the house. It was just, how do you handle that?
Were they
Being chased home, I'd be
They were
running.
people you knew.
No, I didn't know them. No, I didn't know them at all. They'd be maybe teenage boys.
Huh?
Teenage boys. No, I didn't know who they were, but they knew who I was. So it was really terrible. And I thought, I had mentioned that before, I thought of another incident.
What year were you born?
1931.
So 1936, 37 you're talking about. Okay.
Yeah. And when I remember very distinctly when I was 8 years old, and I would often play with a girl who lived 2 streets over, but the same area, but 2 streets over from me, Joanna Poor. Her family owned a jewelry store in downtown New Bedford. My father was a dentist in New Bedford. So we were certainly a perfectly respectable family. And, we lived near them, and I used to play with her. And one day, she said to me, because her grandmother lived with her, and she said to me, "My grandmother said it's all right if I play with a Jewish girl as long as I don't bring her into the house." And it was like being struck by a thunderbolt. It was I was 8 years old, and it was just like somebody hit you over the head. It was just so horrible. My grandmother said it's all right to play with a Jewish girl as long as I don't bring her into the house. And, I never said another word to that girl ever again. I can't tell you the depth of
Do you remember the name of her girl?
Joanna Poor.
Oh, Joanna
Joanna
Poor.
Poor.
You had mentioned the Portuguese churches in town?
Yes, what I mentioned was the fact that my brother, when he wanted to practice, my father had had a different girl assistant, and she got old and she left. And when my brother joined him, they hired a wonderful girl, a Portuguese girl, to assist them in the practice. And she was just wonderful, just perfect. And of course, my father and my brother were very good to her. They paid her well. My brother and his wife, they would buy presents for her children. I think she had one child. And they would buy things for her, and they were just very good to her because they were so grateful. She was so good, and they really appreciated it. And she appreciated them in return. And one day she said, "The priest is wrong. Jewish people are all right." So evidently, from the pulpit, they had heard she had been anti-Semitic things had been said by the Portuguese. She was Portuguese from the Portuguese clergy at that time.
When you were growing up in New Bedford, you ever go into synagogue?
Oh yes, every
Okay.
week. Every week
Were your
we
parents
watched.
observant? Were they? What kind of
Yeah.
synagogue was it?
It was conservative, but we were observant. I grew up in a kosher house. They weren't fanatical, but they were observant, like everybody was. And I remember Saturday morning, early, when, the bath, and my mother would curl my hair, and we'd go off to the synagogue. And then when I got up to be a little older, I went with other kids my age, and they would come by. They lived a little further down, and they would everybody walked in those days. Cars, it was very rare to get a car ride, and so they would come and pick me up, and then we would continue down to the synagogue, which was, I don't know, half mile. It was every Saturday morning.
What, did you observe all the holidays? Did you have a sukkah?
No.
No, well, that's
No, we didn't do that.
that's a good, that gives you a sense of where you
Yeah.
are.
So it was a conservative synagogue. Did the
Yeah.
men and women sit together?
Yes,
They did.
absolutely.
Now, did your siblings marry Jewish women?
They both married Jewish women. The older one, it was a marriage for life. The second one
divorced,
and he remarried someone who's not Jewish.
Mm.
But the four of them, his first wife has remarried. She married someone Jewish. And my brother and his second wife, they are very, very devoted friends. They every holiday they spend together, so the children never have to choose because they're always together.
Wow.
Nobody can believe it. It's just unbelievable. They're really caring. The two wives love each other. I've seen them together. They really, first and second wife. It's just unbelievable. Yeah.
Did you want to add something, Norman?
Well, no, I was thinking you almost end up vying for whose family was poorer. And my father would say how before they moved to Boston, they were so poor. It reminds me, the Johnny Carson shows, that what they really lived on is in the beginning of the season, they'd buy a barrel of pickled herring and have it carried up to the third floor where they lived. And then they would buy day-old brown bread. And the whole family lived on herring and brown bread. He lived to be 93. Died here in Northampton after struggling through business and all this thing.
We're talking about
My father.
made it to 93.
Yeah. Yeah, he died, he was in the business with me. He was right up, he encouraged me to merge. Because when I said we merged with Brando's, he says, yeah, you better do it, you can't really exist as an individual store anymore. And so he merged. And I almost say fortunately, but I know if he were living and I had the option of not selling to CVS or selling, and he didn't talk to him, CVS more or less says, sell to us,
Well,
or
let's
we'll
not
run
go
you
to that.
out.
Come on.
No, but he would have said, you can stick your ground, hold on to the store. And when I sold it, his picture fell.
His picture's in the living room, and when we were discussing it, the whole family together, my daughter, everybody was here, we were discussing whether to do that. His picture fell off the wall.
So I knew.
I knew we said, oh, he doesn't approve of this, and we knew he would not have approved of that.
Did he live on his own until the
Yeah.
end?
Well, for this house, originally before I was married with her, I lived upstairs. I had my own apartment upstairs. Then I got married. I moved out. They stayed here for a while.
We lived in Florence.
Then we were debating about a third child. We needed a larger house.
We had 2 children while we lived in a
Yeah.
two-bedroom apartment.
So my father, I said, Dad, we really should have a larger house. You can use a smaller one. So he negotiated a house with them on Gleason Road. And they lived on Gleason Road in a nice private house. And we moved into this much larger one.
Yeah.
And then my mother died after a period. They lived there for about, 10 years?
I don't know.
They lived there for a while. And then he was alone, and he really couldn't maintain the house by himself. And he moved into Wild sell the apartment.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
In those days, that was very respectable.
Yeah.
It's not anymore.
Just a few more questions. How would you describe your participation, lack of participation in Jewish life in town? If you were asked to describe your Jewishness, what would you say?
Me? I think the agreement I originally made with my mother is I'll go to Hebrew school and do all this, then I need a vacation. And so we get there on the high holidays.
Yeah.
And
His family had already gotten away from Jewish practices quite a bit. I remember when I was first married, and I don't know, my mother's older sister was still living. My mother had died very young. And I remember Norman's mother wanted to impress her how nicely she was treating us, and she said that she had us over for lobster dinners, or she had lobster dinners for us. And I remember the expression on my aunt's face. My mother says, but it was just not even thought of that this was any kind of a deal, to have lobster by his mother,
well, I remember my grandma.
They were very enlightened.
Were you involved in the synagogue life at all in the last 30 years, going to functions?
We've always been members.
Yeah.
I've always been a member of
Jimmy was bar mitzvah.
Yeah.
Janie was bar
yes,
mitzvah.
yeah. But we
Want to join us for a minute?
Yeah.
Can you give us this? We're trying to do intergenerational.
Oh, okay.
If you could give us a sense of growing up Jewish here, what your memories are a little bit, and
watch ahead over there.
what your, if you can, what your sense of it is right now.
Well, Northampton didn't have a huge Jewish population when I was in school, so that the Jewish holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, school would still be going on. I would be at the synagogue. And I had my bar mitzvah on May 8th, 1982. And I think the bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs back then were less of a big party, scene as they are now. Back then I think it was important to, the connection with the religion, but also the family. I mean, I remember very distinctly at my bar mitzvah, my parents got me up and told me, we're going to go to each table, we're going to greet the relatives, because these are relatives you don't know when you're going to see again. As opposed to now, and so I spent all the time talking to family that you never know when you're going to see again. Whereas if you go to these bar mitzvahs now, these kids invite 50 of their schoolmates that they're going to see at school on Monday, and there's loud bands and a DJ, and it's a big party, and the parents do, I think, a terrible job of not having their son or daughter interact and meet family that may have traveled the distance to see them. But anyways, as far as now, I think that Northampton, I know the congregation has really grown in size from where it used to be, and of course from where it was when my father was growing up.
How conscious were you of being Jewish when you were in junior high school and high school?
Well, it's always important, but as I said, in Northampton, you might have had 3 or 4 Jewish kids in your graduating class. You know, it just really wasn't there. I went to a college in a law school that didn't have a huge Jewish population either. There was a program at Western New College. We did have a rabbi, and we sometimes combined our events with the UMass Hillel program, and went to events over there.
You went to Winnick?
Yes.
Gerland.
Jerry
Yeah.
Gerland?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's-
Rabbi Gerland. Yeah,
Right.
it was back in the mid to late '80s.
Still there?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. He was there then. Yeah.
Do you remember some of your Jewish friends growing up, elementary, junior high school,
Oh,
high
yeah.
school? Who can you list them?
Oh, I mean Josh Glazer. And he's in Israel now. Sam Ball was a friend of mine. He's Jewish. Adam Perlman. I mean, there were some of us. See, I went to the campus school at first, and that's where there tended to be more Jewish students because that was the private school. In the high school, not so much. In college, it really, again, wasn't really a Jewish presence at Western New England College. But anyways, those were my impressions. I don't know if
Yeah, I don't remember too many Jewish students in high school in your class.
No, there weren't many.
There weren't many at all. I don't remember any female students.
No. Well, there was one. I saw her at the reunion. Bonnie Cohen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Who's a
Maybe
doctor
some of the-
now.
Maybe some of the Gluckman girls, were they all older than you?
I think a year or two older.
Yeah.
And of course, Simone Topel next door. She was a year older too. She's also a doctor.
Were there events going on when you were in junior high school or high school? After you finish your bar mitzvah, kids often say, well, that was great, I'll see you around, right?
Yeah.
So were there things that were at the synagogue or Jewish events that would attract you?
Well, I kept going. I was on this pace for some reason leading up, and I've always had a horrible time with languages my whole life. Any language, and Spanish and French, I just could not do. So I actually had to be tutored by the rabbi's wife. Rabbi Morse was a rabbi back in the late 70s, early 80s, and his wife, Deborah Morse, tutored me for an hour every week. And so I was on this program where I was doing at least part of the service every other week leading up to my bar mitzvah, and then afterwards it actually continued for a while. And then time, and I think that's where I knew the most as far as being able to read Hebrew, and that was when I was 13, and I'm 39 now. So I think there's been a decline over the years. But
I read there was a period he was going every week.
Yeah.
After.
Yeah, we did think that was like.
well, I think my father
I was
actually
worried.
said he was worried about me going every week. But actually, what happened was I was 13, and then I turned into 14, and then on the weekends I started working actually at my father's drugstore, Bramlin Pharmacy, on a part-time basis on the weekends, and
That's right.
that was kind of a transition away from going on Saturday mornings.
That brings me to a question. I wanted. Can you remember a time when the stores were shut on Shabbat, and then when all the people went to work on Saturday morning?
Now Ken and I talked about this.
Right.
Oh.
There was a gradual thing in this city. In this city, if you were large like Ann August, where they might have 40 employees, 20 of them could go off and leave 20 working. But if you were a small store like Burgers, where they had a mom and pop store, they felt it wasn't fair for Burgers to close and Ann August to be open. So the rule was, if you had enough employees like David Lipshire's with the Bootery and David's, the two shoe stores were combined in the back, and the clerks were interchangeable. Well, David Lipshire's and Leonard Albert's and whoever else was Jewish would take off and leave the whole store to the rest of the help. And so you figure, well, they're not really closing their store, so why should I? And as a drugstore, you felt you can't because it's against even though Christmas would come and they would think nothing of closing Christmas, we felt it was going against the tide to close the drugstore on a day that 98.2% of the people in the city didn't even know it was a holiday.
So, but did you have to be closed on Sunday?
Not a drugstore, we never had to be closed.
Even though you were selling liquor?
No, the point was you could be open, but you mustn't sell liquor.
By the way, you mentioned, popped into my mind about programs with the synagogue that would bring people there. Not with this rabbi, but the rabbi before, Rabbi Philip Graubar, when he was in Northampton. I approached him with a few other Jewish singles. At the time, this was about 8 years ago when he was still there. And what we did is we asked about organizing a singles group that would be supported by the synagogue, because there really had been no program up to that point. So I think there was 4 or 5 of us core members that organized it, that had the meetings, that put together the events, and our first event was a Hanukkah party, and we drew.
What was the name of the group?
I think we called ourselves Pioneer Valley Jewish Singles Group, and it was a short-lived group. It was, probably not even a year. Who was part of it? The group, there was a girl named Elena, there was a guy named Greg. This was back in 2000. I remember very clearly it was 2000. We had about 5 events, and I think each event drew a little bit less people, and then a couple of the core people left. I remember Elena, and I may have the name somewhere, but I remember she worked in a job with PR, so she was very helpful as far as getting the publicity out on it. So we put in a number of publications like the Valley Advocate and the Gazette, Hampshire Life, and we did draw some people because there was a need for it, because I think the synagogues and the Jewish community centers, historically, that's one area. If you said, was there an area that they could improve? I think, bringing Jewish singles together would definitely be, an area they could improve. I know years ago, the West Hartford JCC actually did away with their Jewish singles program with their director, because they said the program wasn't making money for them. And, I would submit that wasn't really the purpose of
It was a
singles
mitzvah
program.
project.
Well, it was short-sighted, because if you don't have the Jewish people meeting, then the families aren't going to grow. And but I think typically the people that make those decisions on the board to eliminate or cut back, in West Hartford's case, actually cut back, and they had a good program for years, are typically made by seniors and people that aren't at that level, because the Jewish single professional people are career-oriented, and they're focused on their careers, and they're not on the boards of these, they're not making the decisions, they just get affected by them.
How did you know you wanted to be a lawyer? You have several generations of people in the pharmacy business, so to speak. How did that happen? You became a lawyer as compared to... Your sister became a pharmacist too, 3 generations.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah,
I actually graduated college in 1990, and I didn't go to law school until 1997. We had Brandon Pharmacy until the end of October '93. So when I graduated college, that's where I was. I may have gone right from college to law school if we didn't have the drugstore to keep.
And if we didn't
go
need them.
Oh, you worked in the drug. I forgot. You worked in the drugstore from
Yeah.
90 to
Managed-
97.
He managed
Well, the
front.
drugstore closed in October 3rd, 1993. So when I graduated in May of '90, I'd always worked in
Yeah.
the store during the summers and vacations, but that's when I really was there full time doing basically the front end of the store. My father, of course, the pharmacy. So, and then when the pharmacy closed in October '93, I stayed in the retail area, and I even managed a bookstore. And then it was time. You get to a
Which
point where
bookstore?
it was a Walden bookstore. Actually, it was a chain bookstore, and you get to a point where if you're going to do this, you got to do this soon, because it's
Managed a
if you go
pharmacy
full.
too.
If you
Managed
go-
a Rite Aid.
Yeah, I managed. I
But then
worked
they
for
left
Rite Aid.
Massachusetts. Rite Aid.
I think if you are going to do something like that, and it's 3 years of law school, and then you've got the bar exam. In my case, 2 bar exams because I took Connecticut after Mass. You gotta get going with it, because otherwise, you're just gonna feel too old. And now I've kind of come full circle back to the school, and I teach a business law class there. So go from being a student, in the mid '80s to law school and teaching. So I really am strongly identified with that school.
What kind of law do you practice?
Well, really 3 areas: Social Security appeals, SSI, SSDI cases, employment law, which includes employment discrimination, and then family law. So I try to limit it to those 3 areas. But I do it.
Family law is what, like
Well,
divorce,
divorce
marriage,
is-
and adoption?
Well, divorces, custody disputes, people that were never married, dealing with their
Division
custody
of-
arrangements. Yeah, and I've done some guardian ad litem work, so that's where you actually have to investigate the situation.
Are there some things you'd like to say before we
The
conclude?
thing I'll always remember about Jimmy, he's probably sick of hearing it, but he and I were working one time Christmas Day, and nobody else wants to work Christmas Day except the 2 Jews that are there, but you do business people remember last minute things, and so out to get every dime and pay expenses in his business, and so he's my front store person. And he was quite young, and he really had a newspaper route around here in this area where he'd come back with different stories. Dogs chased him, and people didn't pay, and so forth. Anyway, this Christmas
People trying
Day,
to cheat a kid.
this Christmas Day, he's working in the store, and this customer walks in. She wants to know where Chanel perfume is. Chanel. So we have the franchise. I mean, it isn't something we had to job out, but we had it. Meant we made a 40% markup. So anyway, he comes up and he says, "Where can I get that?" So I show him it's in a case right here, and he goes and takes it and he wraps it up. It was how much? $25. So he comes running back to me after the sale. He says, "How much did we make it at $25?" I said, "Well, we on a 30% markup, so we made $10. His eyes like this. He says, $10. The next thing I knew, he quit his newspaper route.
He said that's more than I make in a week.
Yeah, that's more than I make in a week,
I'm like,
with dogs chasing him and everything else. So,
he had a newspaper over 3 years.
Yeah, 3 or 4 years.
3 or 4 years.
Though I had about 50 customers. I used to ride around on my bicycle, and deliver them. But I think that's a good job to have at that stage, when you're 10, 11, 12, 13
Yeah.
years old. That's gives you a sense of responsibility.
Did you think your sister would become a pharmacist?
Janie?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, the thing is, she is really gifted in languages. Just like I was horrible in Spanish and French, she had this extreme talent for it. Still does. So that could have been another area if she could have, like a translator, found a niche for that. That could have been the other way. She could have gone. I never forget, in high school, she's 2 years older, and we had the same Spanish teacher. I was in the beginner class, and she had the same Spanish teacher for some advanced class. And my sister Jane was practically teaching the class. And one day, the Spanish teacher said to me, I'll never forget, she said, I guess I'm not being fair to you. You're so poor in Spanish and really can't do anything, and your sister's so gifted. And I ended up dropping that and not finishing the course. And then, she took like a Spanish that majors took at UConn for fun as an electives, and she got straight A's in this.
Yeah.
I mean, she had a real talent for all those languages, and she had no problem with her bar mitzvah. She did actually a good portion of my bar mitzvah. you know how you each have a sibling does part of it. She took a larger role than most siblings take, and I remember that morning of my bar mitzvah, I was worried because she was sick. And she just doesn't have a minor part. She has a big part. And I'm limited to what I can do. We've crafted out enough that the rabbi will, take this, but, I can't really handle any more. Luckily, she pulled through.
So the language thing helped her with pharmacy in terms of the Latin
No.
prescription?
Well, no.
That's
I was just saying that there was two different things. That if she wasn't going to have a career in languages, she would have the career in pharmacy.
No.
Because she loved the prescriptions, where I never really had the interest in what the medications
But
do.
it's,
She never would have been a pharmacist had she not worked with her father, but she became very interested in medications and really, from a very young age.
We got 2 minutes.
Oh,
I was just going to say, there's people all over the Pioneer Valley actually that have a career still today working in drugstore areas because of my father. There's pharmacists, he could name it, I don't know if he has. There's healthcare professionals, there's just people that have continued to stay in the drugstore business after Bramlin Pharmacy that worked for him for 15 years plus.
well,
There was a delivery boy that started with him that became a pharmacist.
A couple of them that never would have done it otherwise.
Janie
We
would
have to
always,
get this again another time.
Janie would always, the only way she'll come in the store,
2 minutes.
she can work with the prescription department. The only way he come in the store if he doesn't work in the prescription department. Janie, every time I fill a prescription, and she'd say, well, Digitalis, what's that for?
Yeah.
Well, that's to slow the heart. Every one of the things she wants to know what it was for, even going way back. Then she did the billing for us before we had computers. And I'll be damned if she didn't know. Every doctor isn't written his name. They have a number, like 7 digits. And she knew them all. She wouldn't even have to refer to anything.
Yeah. We want to thank you. You've given us a
Wonderful
wealth of
stuff, and I hope you'll give
information.
us some more.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
All you asked me to do
No,
is talk for 15
The
minutes.
things that your son has said are very interesting too. After we capture the people who are the older bunch,
Yeah.
we want to switch and turn and
Yeah.
say, okay, let's talk about the 80s or the
Yeah,
70s
yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, I think the thing,
The
that
90s.
the thing where they make a mistake in this is they subsidize, for instance, the program that we have once a month where they furnish the meals. No, but they don't pay enough attention to his group.
That's right. We'll
where
work on
they
it.
should
You know what? We will work on it.
We'll work on
Yeah.
it.
So thank you. So we're going to conclude the interview today, which is March 7th, 2008, with Norman and Charlotte. 7th with
No,
Norman and
yeah.
Charlotte Winston and their son Jim.
Jim.
Jim
And,
Ulysses? No.
No.
James Bennett Winston.
You
James Bennett.
James Bennett Ulysses.
No,
I know. James Bennett.
Yes.
So you have your
Thank you
mother's
so
maiden
much.
name and your father's.
No. He has his grandfather. His father was James Bennett.
Bennett.
His father was
Alright.
James Ulysses Bennett.
We left.
Right, you told the story.
I couldn't take
So
the
he's
Ulysses
James
out.
Bennett Winston. He's named for.
What's your Hebrew name?
It is, I believe it's Chaim. I believe.
Chaim.
Chaim.
Yeah, Chaim, I believe.
Rahmiel? Chaim what?
I can't remember.
It's not on a Kiddush cup someplace.
You'd have to look it up.
I'd have to look, and as I said, I am very bad at languages, and what happened was I got to a point where obviously during my bar mitzvah year I knew what it was and they would call me up. And now, if I was in there and there wasn't a big congregation, I would be worried that they would call my name and I wouldn't know. I really would. I mean, you just asked me and I'm blanking when I said that. Do you know what I said was actually that was my Spanish name. I remember when I took Spanish class, I think that's where that timing came from.
No, and I'm
Spanish. As far as my Hebrew name, I don't remember it now.
I'm terrified that someday I'll be sitting there, and that's when I do my praying. Please don't let him say Nachum Hayim, because I don't know what I'll do. I can't remember. I went to Hebrew school. The agreement was you go these couple of years, you do it, you're through, that's it. And I've really forgotten most of what I knew, except for the Yiddish that somehow I still remember. And I'm afraid when I sit there, somebody's going to say Nachman Hayim, and
They won't say it.
They're going to call you up to the Torah. Nachman Chaim.
Oh God!
Despite all
Don't let him
his
do that to
disclaimers,
me.
He remembers.
Yeah.
He remembers it,
Yeah.
yeah.